Evening of December 11, 1936, a man sat before a microphone at Windsor Castle and told the world he was leaving. His voice was calm. Diction was precise in the way that only a lifetime of preparation makes possible. He said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility, and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do without the help and support of the woman he loved. The BBC carried the broadcast across Britain and the Empire. Millions of people listened in sitting rooms and kitchens and public houses. Many of them cried. The abdication speech lasted about 11 minutes. In that time, Edward VIII delivered what was, from a purely narrative standpoint, one of the most effective pieces of public communication any member of the British royal family has ever produced. What they heard, most of them believed, was a love story, a king choosing a woman over a crown, a romantic sacrifice without precedent in modern history. The story was clean and emotionally satisfying in a way that great public events rarely are, and the world received it gratefully, filed it carefully, treated it for decades. There was only one problem. The British government had been working toward the removal of Edward VIII, for reasons that extended well beyond Wallis Simpson. His admiration for Nazi Germany was documented, shared among senior officials, deeply concerning to the people responsible for the country's foreign policy, at one of the most dangerous moments in modern European history. Conduct as king in the 10 months of his reign had alarmed his own officials from his first week on the throne. Fitness for the constitutional duties of a modern sovereign had been questioned by people who knew him well for years before he ever ascended to, and the woman who became the stated reason for his departure was, in the full telling of the story, the exit route rather than the cause. Wallis Simpson did not bring down a king. She gave a man who had already, in the view of his own government, outstayed his constitutional welcome, means of leaving that preserved the romantic narrative the palace needed. He loved her genuinely and with an intensity that would organize the rest of his life. The departure had been shaped by forces that the abdication speech said nothing about. Forces that the palace then spent the better part of 5 decades ensuring the public would not encounter in their proper context. Is that full story? And to tell it properly, you have to go back a long way before Edward, before Fort Belvedere and the house parties and the summer cruises on borrowed yachts, to a girl born in a Pennsylvania summer resort in 1896, whose father was dead before she could walk, who spent the next 4 decades becoming the most expertly constructed social presence of her generation. Woman who survived poverty with a rich dress, survived an abusive first marriage, survived a year in China that would later be turned into something grotesque by an intelligence community that needed ammunition, and survived, finally, 50 years of being named as the reason for the great constitutional catastrophe of the 20th century. She was many things. She was not what they said she was, and the gap between what she was and what they said she was tells you more about the palace's priorities than anything in the official account. Before we go further, if this kind of deep history is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. These stories take time to research and we put them out every week. You won't want to miss what's coming. Official biography of the abdication crisis begins, in most retellings, with a country house party in January 1931, where Wallis Simpson was introduced to the Prince of Wales for the first time. In many accounts, it is treated as the origin point of everything that followed. The woman arrived, and the king was lost, and the monarchy shook. Version flattens what was a much longer preparation on both sides. The man who met Wallis Simpson in the winter of 1931 had already been shaped 4 decades of a very specific kind of emotional deprivation, and the woman who met him had already been shaped by 3 decades of a very specific kind of economic necessity. The chemistry between them was not accidental. The chemistry of 2 people whose separate histories had produced exactly complementary needs. To understand the abdication, you have to understand both of them. And to understand Wallis, you have to go back to tackle Wallace Warfield. Teakle Wallace Warfield died of tuberculosis on November 15, 1896. His daughter, whom he and his wife Alice had named Bessie Wallis, approximately 5 months old, she would later drop the Bessie entirely, finding it too soft, too round, too accommodating for the person she intended to be. She would be Wallis, just Wallis, the name her father had given her from his own Warfield family, having produced a 7-tackle Wallis of some note in Baltimore's legal history. She would carry it into rooms where it would be whispered about and printed in newspapers and eventually announced over the BBC. In the November of 1896, she was a 5-month-old baby in a borrowed house, and her mother was a 27-year-old widow with nothing. Alice Montague Warfield had married up when she married Teckle, or at least across. The Warfields were a Baltimore family of some standing. They had accumulated money in flour milling, and later in railroads, and they had a name that carried the specific weight of names that had been in a city long enough to be on the sides of buildings. The Montagues, Alice's people, were of distinguished Virginia stock, meant they had the pedigree without the assets, the kind of family that traced its ancestry with one hand while passing the bills with the other. The marriage between Teckle and Alice had not been approved by either family. They had apparently married somewhat hastily, and there is a disputed question in Wallis's biography about whether she was conceived before the wedding, question that researchers have never definitively settled, but that the timing makes plausible. None of this mattered materially, because what mattered was that Teckle was dead, and Alice had a baby, and neither of them had money. They moved in with Teckle's mother in Baltimore. Did not work. They moved again to a more modest neighborhood, where Alice ran a small boarding house for a period and supplemented whatever provided with the charitable support of her late husband's wealthier brother. That brother was Solomon Davies Warfield. He was an important figure in Baltimore's business and civic life, a bachelor who had accumulated money in the organized way of men who make money, primary occupation. He was not warmly described by any of the people who knew him. He was tight, exacting, moralistic in the way that Victorian businessmen often were, and he regarded his sister-in-law and her daughter as a problem to be managed rather a family to be loved. He paid for Wallis's education at the Arundel School and eventually at Oldfields, most expensive and most prestigious girls' school in Maryland. He paid the fees precisely and without generosity of spirit, making clear that the payments were a family obligation rather than an expression of affection. The obligation was conditional on Wallis's conduct being such as not to embarrass him. Wallis grew up understanding exactly what that meant. She understood it with the specific clarity of a child who has learned early that the comfort around her is not hers by right but by someone else's sufferance. She watched her mother navigate the social geography of Baltimore society with insufficient resources, and she registered precision that would serve her well in every room she subsequently entered, exactly how it was done. She watched the women who had money perform their comfort, and the women who didn't perform theirs. She learned the distinction between the two performances with a sharpness that her formal education never quite matched. Oldfield School gave her the vocabulary of old money, of certain kinds of clothes and certain kinds of table manners and certain kinds of reference. She was at the top of her class in the subjects that Oldfields considered important, which were the subjects of social presentation rather than academic performance, and she learned them genuinely and applied them permanently. She was immaculately dressed, by every account, from the time she was old enough to have opinions about it. She had opinions about food and flowers and the arrangement of rooms. She had opinions about conversation and knew how to direct it. She was also, by her own account and by the accounts of everyone who knew her then, not beautiful in the conventional sense that her era required. Angular where softness was expected. Her jaw was too strong, her eyes too watchful. She had what people who found her attractive called presence, and what people who didn't called sharpness. She was aware of the distinction, and had decided very early that she would make the second serve in lieu of the first. By 1914, when she left Oldfields and entered Baltimore society as a young woman eligible for marriage, Wallis Warfield was 28 months past the average age at which the kind of woman she was supposed to be entered that market. She had been delayed by her family circumstances, and delay in those circles was itself a social fact that required management. She managed it. She attended the balls and the house parties and the private dinners of Baltimore's social season, with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the next few years of her life would determine a great deal about what the years after them would look like. She was funny. Counts of people who knew her in those years returned to this consistently. She was funny in a specific dry, observational way that made people around her feel that she was paying them a quality of attention that they didn't always receive elsewhere. She made you feel noticed. She was capable of saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, or the wrong thing in a way that somehow worked better than the right thing would have. She had the social instincts of a person who has spent years watching how rooms operate and has drawn conclusions about what they respond to. What she wanted in 1914 and into 1915 and then into 1916 was a way out of the position she was in. Not out of Baltimore specifically, that would come. Out of the specific condition of dependence on other people's money. She wanted a life that was hers. She had built rather than inherited. And in the options available to her at that moment, marriage was the mechanism. Spencer looked like the mechanism. Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. was 25 years old when Wallis met him in the spring of 1916, house in Florida where she was visiting a cousin. He was a lieutenant in the United States Navy and one of the first 20 men to have earned naval aviator's wings, which in 1916 meant something. Aviation was new enough to seem romantic rather than merely technical. It was the kind of skill that other men envied and women found arresting. Spencer wore it with the easy confidence of a man who was good at things. He was also, by every account, physically attractive. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with the bearing that naval training produces in men who were already inclined toward self-presentation. He danced well. He was socially fluent in the ways that the military community produced, comfortable across a range of people and contexts. He focused his attention on Wallis with an intensity that she found, after the years of careful social navigation in Baltimore, irresistible. Came engaged within months of that first meeting. They married on November 8, 1916, in Baltimore, in a ceremony that was small enough to reflect the family's circumstances and grand enough to satisfy the minimum requirements of her uncle's dignity. Wallis wore her grandmother's wedding dress, which was either economically necessary or sentimentally chosen, depending on which account you accept. He moved with Wynne to his various postings. The Navy moved its officers with regularity, and Wallis followed, from Norfolk to San Diego to Washington to Coronado, learning the specific social world of military wives. With the adaptability she brought to every new environment, she discovered that she was good at this world too, at creating a domestic space that people wanted to be in, regardless of whether quarters were good, at finding in any posting the social circle worth knowing, and making herself known to it. She also discovered, gradually and then all at once, that she had married a man whose relationship with alcohol was already past the point of social drinking and had been, probably before she met him. Wynne Spencer drank with the systematic commitment of a man for whom drinking was not recreation but maintenance. He drank at parties and he drank alone. He drank in the specific way that naval culture in that era sometimes enabled, in which excess was tolerated as long as the performance of duty was sustained. Performance of duty in Spencer's case was sustained until it wasn't. His temper, always linked to the drinking, became a feature of their domestic life that Wallis managed with a combination of tactical patience and an increasingly clear-eyed assessment of her options. The violence was documented later rather than at the time. Wallis was not the kind of woman who made reports or scenes. She had been raised to manage difficulties privately and to present publicly whatever was required. Marriage that was failing was managed the same way. She mentioned in letters to people she trusted that things were difficult. Did not specify. Her friend Mary Raffray, who knew her better than most, later wrote that the difficulties included physical abuse, serious enough to require medical attention, and when Wallis eventually went to China and required medical treatment in Hong Kong, Raffray's account was that it was Wynne's hands rather than a kidney infection that had produced the injury. By 1920 they were separated, reconciled twice briefly, and the reconciliations failed. The marriage continued as a legal fact long after it had ceased to function as anything else because divorce was a social cost that Wallis was not yet ready to pay. The separation years were not idle. She had moved to Washington, where she had social connections and a life independent of Wynne Spencer's postings. She met an Argentine diplomat named Felipe Espil at a party and fell into a serious relationship that lasted several years. Bill was intelligent and cultured and geographically unsuitable, his government's expectations of its diplomats' wives more rigorous than Wallis's. Biography could satisfy. When he ended the relationship in 1924, Wallis was 27, twice separated from her husband but not yet divorced, in love with a man who had told her she wasn't good enough for his career, and being supported in Washington by the charity of a friend. She received, spring of 1924, a stack of letters from Wynne Spencer asking her to come to China. He had been posted to Hong Kong, commanding a gunboat called the Pampanga on the South China Patrol. He missed her. He had reformed. He wanted her to come. She went. Whether this was genuine hope that the marriage could be saved, or an acceptance that a change of scene was better than staying where she was, or simply the absence of a better alternative at that particular moment, one of the things Wallis never fully explained in any document that survives. She boarded the USS Chaumont at Norfolk on July 17, 1924, began the 6-week voyage to a part of the world she had never seen. She arrived in Hong Kong on September 8. Wynne was on the dock. Followed has been the most contested period of Wallis Simpson's biography. Not because the facts are difficult to establish, because the facts were subsequently weaponized into something far removed from what actually happened, and the weaponization was so effective and so thoroughly repeated that it eventually became more real in the public imagination than anything humanable. When Spencer had not reformed, the violence came quickly in Hong Kong. Wallis's friend Mary Raffray, who received Wallis's confidences about this period, wrote later that Wynne had beaten Wallis severely enough in Hong Kong to cause internal bleeding. Wallis had required medical treatment. Wallis herself in her memoir wrote that she developed a kidney infection. Two accounts are not necessarily incompatible, and the precise etiology of the medical emergency is less important than the decision it produced. Wallis decided in Hong Kong in the autumn of 1924 that the marriage was finished. She communicated this to Wynne. Wynne's response was to take her to the brothels of Hong Kong's harbour district, making her watch and threatening to kill her if she left. It is documented in the accounts of people Wallis confided in. It is not pleasant material, and it was never published during the years when it would have most complicated the narrative being constructed around her character. She separated herself from Wynne and made her way to Shanghai, where she would spend the better part of the next several months. Divorce proceedings, she had been advised, would take time. She had some money from Wynne's naval pay and the network of social connections that Americans in the East tended to share across their various postings. She was on her own in a foreign country in the middle of a civil war, with no clear immediate future, and she dealt with this the way she dealt with most things. She made herself interesting enough to be useful. Shanghai in 1924 was a city unlike any other in the world. The international settlement and the French concession sat inside a Chinese city that was pulled apart by the conflict between warlords and nationalists and the remnants of imperial authority. Foreign nationals who inhabited the concessions had built an elaborate social world that operated with studied indifference to the chaos. Outside its gates, it was cosmopolitan in the specific way that colonial outposts become cosmopolitan. Everyone from everywhere, all of the usual rules suspended, the social hierarchies of home replaced by improvised ones based on money and wit and the capacity for entertaining company. Wallis had an affair with Alberto da Zara, a well-connected Italian naval officer who would later become an admiral, a fascist loyalist, Bellini's son-in-law by marriage. She moved in circles that included journalists and businessmen and the children of old international trading families. She attended parties that started at midnight and ended at dawn, and she learned in the Shanghai of the middle 1920s the world looked like when its conventional rules were temporarily suspended. None of this was shameful. The social life of a woman with time on her hands in a city that rewarded the social, but it was material, and 10 years later, British intelligence community was looking for something to use against her, built something from that material that bore very little relationship to what had actually happened. There is a particular kind of social education that happens in the space between what your family used to be and what it can currently afford. Wallis Warfield received that education in full. The Baltimore of her childhood was a city that understood lineage in specific terms. Were the families who had always had money, and the families who had once had money, and the families who were working toward money, and the families who had a name that meant something, and the families who had only a name. Warfields fell into a class that is both privileged and precarious, the class of people with the right connections and insufficient resources to maintain them comfortably, and the dynamics of that class leave marks that last. Her uncle Solomon Davies Warfield, bachelor businessman who controlled the family money, was not the kind of man who provided charity without strings. Strings were social rather than financial in their expression. Wallis was expected to perform well enough at Oldfields to justify the fees, present herself in Baltimore society in a way that reflected well on the family name, make the kind of marriage that would resolve the question of her dependency without creating any new ones. Were not unreasonable expectations. They were the expectations of a man who had made money by understanding what things cost and who was extending his financial reach only as far as his calculations of return made defensible. Wallis absorbed all of this and said nothing she wasn't required to say. This was another form of education. Specific social skills she developed at Oldfields were the skills of observation and adaptation. She noticed what women with money wore and how they wore it. She noticed the quality of indirection that marked how wealthy women of that era expressed preferences and assessments, a particular way of not quite saying the negative thing while making sure it was communicated. She noticed which rooms people wanted to be in, and what the rooms that people wanted to be in had in common. She began to develop what would become, by her 30s, an almost infallible sense of how to create exactly the environment she wanted around. She was a reader. She read widely in the literature and history that the Baltimore and Washington social worlds of her youth treated as educated currency, and she read past those into the French novels and the European intellectual material that were available at the city's better libraries, that most of her contemporaries found unnecessary. This reading did not make her an intellectual in the formal sense. She never became a woman of great scholarly depth, but it gave her a specific quality of conversational range that allowed her to move across topics and registers, and that was one of the things Edward, whose own reading was thinner than his position suggested it should be, found impressive. She learned French, not the perfunctory French of the finishing school, but actual French, well enough to be comfortable in Paris social situations, well enough to conduct a real conversation, well enough to read. This was not universal among Baltimore young women of her generation, and it reflected a decision she had made, consciously or not, about the kind of person she was going to become. The decision, insofar as it was a conscious one, was about range. She was going to be the kind of person who could be in any room. She was going to be the kind of person whose value was not limited to the Baltimore society that had produced her, and that she could see clearly. A small stage. She was going to become someone whose capabilities exceeded any single social environment. She was going to do this by learning every environment she entered until she understood it well enough to move through it without friction. It is not unusual as an ambition. What was unusual was the thoroughness with which she pursued it. Absence of the vanity that often derails this kind of ambition in young women who discover early that they're good at something. Willingness to start over in new environments, rather than resting on what she had already learned. China was the clearest demonstration of this willingness. Wallis arrived in Shanghai in the autumn of 1924 with no friends, limited money, abusive husband she had just fled in Hong Kong, and no plan beyond the vague hope that the sophistication of the city would provide some kind of future. The time she left in the summer of 1925, she had built a social world in Shanghai, been received in its major houses and clubs and social occasions, and had assembled a network of contacts that she would maintain, in some cases, decades. The thing she built in Shanghai was not merely a social network, it was a kind of fluency. Shanghai in 1924 was a city where the usual rules of social life had been suspended and replaced by a much more fluid set of arrangements in which money mattered more than birth and wit more than either. Wallis was not rich in Shanghai, and she was not connected in the sense that mattered in London or Baltimore, and she thrived anyway, because the combination of social intelligence and physical precision, and the specific quality of tension she brought to people, was sufficient. The city rewarded people who could be interesting, and Wallis could be interesting anywhere. She left China with something more important than a set of social skills. She left with a framework for understanding how social environments work, framework that was sufficiently general to be applicable across contexts. She understood that the formal rules of any social world are secondary to the informal ones. The people who run rooms are not always the people with the highest formal rank. The conversation at a dinner table is the product of deliberate planning rather than spontaneous chemistry. The most valuable thing any person can bring to a social occasion is the focused, specific attention that makes whoever they are talking to feel that they are the most interesting person in the room. She spent the rest of the 1920s applying this framework in Washington and then in London. In London, she found the room she had been building toward. The room where the people who mattered in British public life gathered in the informal settings that were, in some respects, more important than the formal ones. Houses and dinner parties and country weekends where policy was really discussed, and where the relationships that made careers happened. World of Mayfair and Belgravia, where the social and the political and the aristocratic overlapped, where a well-run drawing room in the right part of town could put you in proximity to the people who ran things. She reached that room through Ernest Simpson, who had the connections, and she held her place in it through her own abilities, which were real. Dinners at Bryanston Court that people remembered as unusually good were unusually good because Wallis applied to them the systematic intelligence she applied to everything. She thought about who should meet whom and organized the placement accordingly. She prepared for conversations rather than merely hoping they would happen. She chose food with the same care that a conductor chooses a program, understanding that the experience of being well fed creates a specific quality of good feeling in people that makes them more open to the conversation you want them to have. She was not a warm woman in the way that the Queen Mother was warm, all-embracing approachable warmth that makes people feel safe. She was precise in her warmth, selective in its application. Selection made the recipients feel it more rather than less. She gave her attention the way a very good editor gives notes, specifically, outwaste with an implied confidence in the recipient's ability to use what she was offering. People remembered conversations with Wallis Simpson because she had remembered them. Prince of Wales was introduced to her at Borough Court in January 1931. He was encountering a woman who had been building toward exactly his kind of room for her entire adult life, and who had the specific abilities that made her valuable in it. He had met women who were beautiful, and women who were clever, and women who were ambitious, and women who were sophisticated. He had not, apparently, met a woman who combined all of these with the specific quality of management she brought to him. She managed him. Is not a criticism. Managing people is a skill, and the people who have it are genuinely valuable to those who need it. Edward needed it with an urgency that his 36 years of being a prince had not resolved. He needed someone who would tell him what to wear and what to eat and whom to see and what to say to them, who would run the domestic environment in which he spent his private time with the thoroughness that made it comfortable, who would do all of this without making him feel diminished by needing it. Wallis did all of this. She also argued with him. This was perhaps the most important thing, more important than the management, because Edward had spent his life surrounded by people who agreed with him, or who disagreed with him through the formal channels of official advice he could choose to ignore. Wallis disagreed with him in the immediate informal personal register that is the mode of domestic life. He could not ignore it in the same way, and the experience of someone who genuinely disagreed with him and said so was one he had been missing. Attachment that developed between them after Thelma Furness's displacement in early 1934 was rapid in its intensity and steady in its maintenance. He wrote to Wallis constantly. He called her by the telephone, which was still a relatively intimate mode of communication in the mid-1930s, frequency that her friends found remarkable. He arranged official engagements to be close to where she was. He brought her to official events that she should not strictly have attended as the wife of Ernest Simpson rather than as the companion of the Prince of Wales. Ernest Simpson continued to appear at Fort Belvedere through most of 1934 and 1935. Created a social situation of considerable delicacy that all the participants managed with a public composure that belied, in each case, more complicated inner reality. Ernest had by 1935 begun his own involvement with Mary Raffray, who was Wallis's friend from their Washington years, and who was a steady, warm, capable woman, who received Ernest's affection with genuine feeling. That this was a response to the situation with Wallis or an independent development is not entirely clear. Its timing was convenient for everyone who needed the marital situation to move toward formal resolution. Wallis filed for divorce from Ernest in 1936. The proceedings moved through the British courts with the speed that proceedings of this kind moved in era, which was not fast. The decree nisi was granted in October 1936, with the absolute decree to follow 6 months later. Timing was significant. It placed the formal end of the second marriage in the middle of the brewing constitutional crisis. The palace and the government were acutely aware of the implications. A twice-divorced woman phrase was used by everyone who opposed the marriage. It was used by Baldwin. It was used by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Used by the Dominion Prime Ministers. It became a kind of shorthand for the specific kind of disqualification that the Church of England, which the British monarch is supreme governor, could not accept. A woman whose 2 previous husbands were still living could not, Church's view, enter into a valid Christian marriage. The monarch could not be a person who had contracted an invalid Christian marriage. Logic was coherent and the institution was fixed. What the phrase also did, and what the people who deployed it understood it did, locate the objection to the marriage on the most defensible ground available, ground that appeared to be about principle rather than about politics. appeared to be about religious scruple rather than about intelligence assessments and diplomatic cables, and the contents of the Germany files were already accumulating in the Foreign Office. Twice divorced was a reason that could be stated in a newspaper. German connection was a reason that could not be, not in December 1936, in a country whose alliance with France against a German threat was still the central organizing fact of its foreign policy. The China dossier, best historians have been able to determine, was either a document compiled at the behest of Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in late 1934 or 1935, British intelligence services, or a fiction, or something between the two, loose collection of rumours and second-hand accounts, given the formal weight of an intelligence product without the verification that an honest intelligence product would require. The allegations it supposedly contained were specific and deliberately humiliating. Wallis Simpson, according to the accounts of people who claimed to have seen the dossier, or to have been told its contents by people who had while in Shanghai developed a sexual technique known variously as the Shanghai grip or the Chinese grip, described with the kind of clinical prurience that intelligence-adjacent gossip specializes in, had used this technique on the Prince of Wales to make herself, in the language that circulated in certain Mayfair drawing rooms, indispensable to him. The implication was that his attachment was not love but a kind of sexual dependence engineered by a woman who had learned her craft in environments that decent people did not discuss. The dossier also allegedly included references to Wallis's relationship with Win Spencer's brothel visits, which the document transformed from evidence of abuse endured into evidence of participation sought. Suggested she had been an opium user. In its most extreme versions, it described her as a prostitute. No original copy of this document has ever been found, not in the Public Record Office, not in the National Archives, in the files of the Security Service to the extent that those files have been made available to researchers, not in any American archive. Historian Paul French, who spent years researching Wallis's time in China, and whose book Her Lotus Year is the most thorough examination of that period yet written, concluded after exhaustive research that the specific allegations about brothels and sexual techniques could not be substantiated any primary source, and that the most probable origin of the dossier's contents was the rumors generated by Win Spencer's retaliatory behavior during the marriage's final months in China, shaped by the informal intelligence network of British naval and diplomatic personnel in the region, and, given a coat of official authority it did not deserve. None of this stopped the dossier from circulating. In the world of 1935 and 1936, closed social and political world of senior British government and court life, a document existed, people knew of it, people referred to it. Archbishop of Canterbury Cosmo Lang knew of it, the Queen Mother, then Duchess of York, knew of it, Stanley Baldwin, who had authorized its compilation if the most charitable account of his role is accepted, certainly knew of it. Function of the dossier was not to provide evidence for a judicial proceeding. Function was to ensure that when the marriage question finally became a public crisis, people who needed to oppose the marriage had a private understanding of Wallis Simpson that went beyond the formal objections, gave the opposition a visceral dimension that made Wallis into something specific and contaminating rather than simply inconvenient. It worked. Private world it was intended for. The Archbishop of Canterbury, when the crisis arrived, spoke and wrote about Wallis in terms that suggested a very particular kind of horror, a horror that the simple fact of twice divorce, serious as that was in ecclesiastical terms, does not fully explain. The public never saw the dossier. The public received a simpler story. King wanted to marry a divorced American woman, and the church and the government, and the Dominion governments all said no. The story was true as far as it went. The further it went, the less true it became. Wallis returned to the United States from China in 1925, 29 years old. The divorce from Win Spencer was proceeding through the American courts. She settled in Washington while it completed, staying with friends and renewing connections that had survived the years of her marriage and its dissolution. She was noticeably changed by the China year in ways that her Washington acquaintances remarked on. She was more assured. She dressed with a specificity that was distinctly European. She had opinions about politics and art and food that went well beyond the conversational platitudes that Baltimore drawing rooms had accepted from young women. She had also, through the affair with Alberto de Zara and the other connections she had made in Shanghai, developed a facility with men of a certain worldly confidence that would serve her well in the room she was about to enter. Divorce from Win Spencer was granted in December 1927. She was 31 years old, technically a free woman for the first time in her adult life, and she had no money, no permanent home, and no obvious plan. What she had was a social network that extended across Washington and New York, and a small circle of American expatriates in London. She had the particular talent of making that network feel larger and more valuable than its actual size. Ernest Aldrich Simpson entered her life in the way that important things often enter lives under financial pressure, through a mutual friend and a shared dinner party, with no particular drama in Washington in 1926. He was Anglo-American, been born in New York but educated in England at Eton and then at Christ Church, Oxford. His family ran a shipping business with offices in New York and London, and Ernest had gone into the family firm after university, managing its British operations from London. He was 31 when they met, a year older than Wallis. He was currently in the late stages of his own marriage dissolution. He was not exciting in the way that Win Spencer had been exciting. He was not glamorous, and he did not perform. He was quiet, steady, deeply knowledgeable about English history and literature in ways that he carried out display, and he was kind in the specific way of people for whom kindness is a considered habit rather than an occasional gesture. He was also not rich enough to solve Wallis's financial situation permanently, though he was comfortable enough to make it less pressing. Married on July 20, 1928, after his divorce was finalized and hers had been for several months, Wallis moved to London, Ernest's business required, and began the project of building the social world she had been working toward for more than a decade. 32 years old, she had been twice married and was now in her third arrangement with the institution. She had lived on 3 continents, survived an abusive marriage, spent a year in the most cosmopolitan city she had ever encountered, educated by necessity in the full range of ways that financial precarity educates people, and she arrived in London with a clarity about what she wanted and what she was good at that her earlier years had been building toward. Flat at Bryanston Court in Marylebone was not large. Ernest Simpson's income was solid rather than spectacular. London they inhabited was the comfortable professional tier of English life, rather than the aristocratic one. Wallis turned the flat into exactly what she had always planned to have, a place that people wanted to come to, table at which the food was consistently better than anyone expected, a drawing room in which the conversation was managed by someone who had thought about who should sit next to whom and why. She was by every account, from the people who attended those early dinners at Bryanston Court, exceptional hostess, not exceptional in the way of great wealth which can purchase excellence without art, exceptional in the way of intelligence applied to the social. She chose her guests with the care of a conductor building a program. She prepared for the conversations she wanted to have with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that improvisation is really just very fast preparation, and she made every person in the room feel that they were particularly wanted there that evening, for reasons she had specifically considered. She was building toward the room she had always wanted to be in. Room that contained the most interesting, most powerful, most socially significant people in England. By late 1930, through the connections of an American friend named Consuelo Thor, whose sister Thelma was then the companion of the Prince of Wales, she was being invited to events that put her in proximity to the outer circle of that room. Borough Court meeting in January 1931 has been described so many times in so many different accounts that it has taken on the slightly staged quality of events that history has needed to be significant. Thelma Furness was the hostess. The Prince of Wales was the principal guest. Wallis and Ernest Simpson were among the other guests, invited through the Thor connection, present at a house party in Leicestershire, where the social occasion was hunting, and the social reality was the same informal court that gathered wherever the prince happened to be. Edward, Prince of Wales, was 36 years old. He had been heir to the throne for more than 2 decades. He had served in the First World War in a role frustratingly close to the fighting, without ever being allowed to reach it. Toured the empire repeatedly, shaking hands with hundreds of thousands of people across Canada and Australia and India and South Africa, and leaving behind in every case a trail of genuine goodwill and genuine affection, because he was good at the public performance of connection in a way his family's more formal representatives often were not. He had the specific gift of making individuals feel met rather than processed. In a monarchy learning to operate in the age of mass media, this was worth a great deal. He was also in the understanding of everyone who worked closely with him, genuinely unsuited to the throne in ways that had nothing to do with Wallis Simpson and everything to do with his own character. Tommy Lascelles had worked as his assistant private secretary from 1920 until 1929. He resigned the position in a state of professional despair that he documented later in private letters and diaries. The specific incident that pushed him to resign had occurred in 1928 when King George V had fallen seriously ill in Bognor Regis and Edward had been East Africa on a tour. Word had been sent asking him to come home urgently. Edward had delayed his return, apparently having decided that the summons was not as urgent as the political establishment was representing it to be. Lascelles was so appalled by this response that he told a mutual friend he wanted to shoot the prince. He wrote later that he had told Edward directly that his behavior on that occasion was disgraceful. Edward's response had been to look at him with a kind of surprised blankness, though the accusations was coming from a language he didn't recognize. Lascelles returned to royal service in 1935, joining the household of George V and then remaining in service through the reigns of Edward and George VI, eventually becoming private secretary to George VI and then to the young Queen Elizabeth II. He served the institution with a devotion that his private papers reveal was sometimes close to despair. He was a highly intelligent man who understood the constitutional function of monarchy with rare precision. He watched Edward with the weary attention of someone who already knows how the story ends. Meeting between Wallis and Edward at Borough Court in 1931 was by Wallis's own account unremarkable. They spoke briefly. She said something about central heating that he apparently found funny. He was amused by her directness in a way that was not typical of his experience with women in those rooms. Tended to manage their speech carefully in his presence. They met again at various subsequent occasions. Simpsons were invited to Fort Belvedere, Edward's retreat in Windsor Great Park, for house parties organized by Thelma Furness. Edward began to pay Wallis a specific quality of attention that was different from his general social ease. He watched her in rooms. He sought her out at dinner. He wrote to her. By 1933, Wallis Simpson was a regular presence at Fort Belvedere. By 1934, she was the most important one. Thelma Furness traveled to New York in January 1934 on a family matter. Before she left, she asked Wallis to look after the prince while she was gone. Thelma later wrote about this in her memoir, with the rueful clarity of someone who has decades to understand what they were doing wrong. She trusted Wallis. She had come to consider Wallis a friend. She left her friend in her house with her man, and returned from New York 2 months later to find that the arrangement she had left behind no longer existed. Edward's letters to Wallis during those February weeks have been described by historians who have read them as remarkable documents. Emotional intensity. He needed her. He needed to see her, to speak to her, to know she was coming. He wrote with the urgency of a man for whom the ordinary intervals of a social relationship had become insupportable. 40 years old, and he was writing like someone who had just discovered that attachment was possible. What Wallis made of this, how she felt about the transformation from Thelma's stand-in to the center of Edward's world, is less clearly documented. She was not a romantic in the way he was. She had been badly treated by the first man she had loved romantically, been let down by the second in a different way, and had spent her adult life developing a relationship with the idea of security that was more practical than sentimental. Edward offered her security of a kind she had never had access to. He also offered complication of a kind she had not sought. She did not end her marriage to Ernest Sim quickly. She did not, in fact, end it until she was required to. Ernest continued to appear at Fort Belvedere weekends with her well into 1934 and 1935, conducting himself with a measured dignity that people observed and did not entirely understand. Whether he was waiting for the situation to resolve itself, or had already assessed it correctly and was managing his own exit carefully, or was simply paralyzed by a situation that offered no attractive option. One of those questions that people who knew him well tended to answer differently. By 1935, Ernest had begun a relationship with Mary Raffray, Wallis's friend, the same Mary Raffray, who would later be one of the few people to whom Wallis told the truth about her first marriage's violence. Was a configuration of considerable delicacy in which all the participants were moving at speeds that didn't quite match. Ernest toward Mary. Mary perhaps toward Ernest. Wallis towards something she had not fully decided to name. Edward in 1935 had no such ambiguity. He knew what he wanted. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson. Fort Belvedere was a country house on the edge of Windsor Great Park. Edward had been given the use of it in 1929 by his father, who found the mock Gothic folly with its battlements and its overgrown gardens vaguely absurd and expected his son to grow tired of it within a season. Edward did not grow tired of it. He cut back the undergrowth himself. Physical, purposeful way he had, when outdoor activity gave him something concrete to do, turned it into the private retreat he had always wanted. A place small enough to feel like a house, rather than a royal residence, and far enough from London to provide the sensation of escape without the difficulties of an actual escape. House mattered to Wallis because the house was where her authority over Edward's life became concrete. She furnished rooms. She supervised the kitchen. She brought to Fort Belvedere the domestic intelligence she had been developing since her Washington years, and that had reached its most sophisticated expression in the flat at Bryanston Court. The ability to make an interior environment feel both considered and comfortable, to produce dinners that seemed effortless and were the result of careful planning, to arrange a weekend in the country so that the right people met each other at the right moments in circumstances that encouraged the conversations you wanted them to have. The guests at Fort Belvedere through 1934 and 1935 were not the formal court in any official sense, were the people Edward actually liked, which was a considerably different roster. Politicians of the reformist variety, Americans who had made themselves interesting, writers and artists who had learned to wear their talent lightly enough to be received in houses where too much visible intelligence made people uncomfortable, friends from the war years and the overseas tours who had never quite fitted back into ordinary categories. Ernest Simpson was among them, or was for a while, attending the weekends at Fort Belvedere with Wallis in the configuration. Everyone involved maintained the polite fiction of treating as normal. Thelma Furness, been Edward's companion for 3 years before Wallis's arrival in that role, gave an account of her displacement that is precise enough to have been studied by everyone who has written seriously about this period. The story she told in the memoir she published in 1958 with her twin sister Gloria Vanderbilt is of a specific betrayal. She asked Wallis to keep an eye on the prince during a visit to the United States in early 1934, relying on the friendship she believed they had, and returned to find the terrain permanently changed. Whether the displacement was deliberate, or whether it was the natural consequence of two people spending increasing time together without the person who had previously mediated the situation, is a question Thelma's account cannot resolve. Does establish is that the transition was swift, that Thelma recognized it immediately on her return. Edward's behavior toward her when she came back from America was consistent with a man who had already decided. The Freda Dudley Ward story precedes the Thelma story by a decade, is less well documented, but in some ways more telling. Freda Dudley Ward had been Edward's primary companion through most of the 1920s, married woman with her own domestic arrangements who had understood the nature of her role and had maintained it with discretion and good humor for years. The ending of that relationship came through a telephone call in the spring of 1934, or so the account that has circulated says. Freda called the Fort Belvedere switchboard. The operator said she had orders not to put her through. That was the last communication she received from Edward directly. If that account is accurate, and it has circulated long enough and in enough credible forms to carry at least circumstantial weight, tells you something specific about how Edward managed transitions. He did not confront. He withdrew, and withdrew completely, delegated the news of the withdrawal to the machinery around him, rather than delivering it himself. Women he left did not receive explanations. They received silence, the kind of silence that is itself a communication, and that is not the communication of a man accustomed to the emotional responsibilities of normal adult relationships. Wallis understood this. She had watched him manage Thelma's departure, and had watched the Fort Belvedere telephone operate. She had the specific intelligence of a woman who has lived through enough change of circumstances to know that her position required active maintenance rather than the passive confidence that someone with inherited security could permit herself. She managed Edward. She managed the environment that contained him. She managed the social world that he inhabits, understood that his need for order and beauty and the sense of being surrounded by people who had been carefully chosen was genuine and continuous, would not be met by accident. The letters Edward wrote to Wallis during the years of their relationship are among the most extraordinary documents the Abdication has left behind, not because of their romantic content, which is extensive, because of what they reveal about the dynamics of the relationship they describe. They were published in part by Michael Bloch in 1986, drawing on documents that had been preserved in the Windsor archive, and their effect on the reader is the opposite of the romantic narrative they be expected to support. He wrote to her as a man in a condition of permanent need. The letters ask whether she loves him, ask whether she will see him. They describe his state of mind in the hours of her absence in terms that read as clinical anxiety rather than romantic longing. The difference being that romantic longing carries an expectation of the beloved's return, whereas what Edward expressed was something closer to the terror of someone who is not sure the anchor will hold. He called her his darling and his beloved, and W.E. capitalization that he used for the two of them as a unit, a royal adjacent usage applied to a domestic category. She did not write to him in the same register. Her letters, the ones that have survived and been published, warmer than her public manner suggested but steady, where his were turbulent, affectionate rather than desperate. She was managing him, even in correspondence. She was giving him what he needed without giving him everything he wanted. It is a distinction that requires considerable skill, and that people who mistake need for love sometimes miss entirely. Social world of Fort Belvedere in 1935 was the world of a man who was about to be king, and who had chosen to make his private domestic arrangements the axis around which everything else organized. His official engagements were performed with the charm that made his public appearances genuinely popular. The correspondence from the public during his time as Prince of Wales and his 10 months as king is remarkable for the warmth of ordinary people's attachment to him, an attachment that rested on his accessibility, his informality, willingness to appear in public without the stiff ceremony that his father had worn like armor. People liked him. The people who worked with him, opposed to the people who watched him from a crowd, had a more complicated experience. Approach to official papers was a running source of anxiety for the private secretaries and government officials who depended on the red boxes, processed in a reasonable time. The boxes contained matters requiring the monarch's attention, letters requiring his signature, state documents requiring his review, foreign office papers summarizing diplomatic situations, cabinet minutes. Constitutional monarch's engagement with these documents is partly ceremonial but partly functional. Sovereign's access to government papers is one of the institutional practices that allows the monarchy to play its advisory and moderating role. George V had been meticulous. He had read everything, annotated some of it, and kept the boxes moving. Edward's boxes were returned late, marked minimally, sometimes returned with evidence that they had been opened and closed without being read in any thoroughness. Is documented in the private accounts of people who handled the boxes, and it is consistent across multiple sources representing different political perspectives. It is not a partisan account. The boxes did not get done. State papers accumulated. Officials worried about the security of documents that were being held at Fort Belvedere in circumstances that were not entirely controlled. At least one official memorandum from this period raised the question of whether certain sensitive communications should be diverted away from the standard royal channel, because the channel was not being maintained with the expected rigor. Combination of neglected boxes, documented pro-German communications with foreign representatives, and the emerging marriage crisis created, the autumn of 1936, a situation in which the officials responsible for the functioning of the constitutional machinery were looking at a specific problem. The machinery required a person at its center who would engage with it reliably, and the person at its center was not doing that. Wallis did not cause this problem. She is frequently, in the less careful versions of the story, given a kind of reverse agency here, though her presence at Fort Belvedere was what prevented the boxes from being done, or what distracted the king from his German policy. Communications. The neglect of the boxes predated her centrality in his life. The German sympathies predated her arrival in the relevant circles. Personality that Lascelles had documented in 1929, before Wallis was a factor in Edward's life at all. The same personality that was causing problems in 1936. She arrived in a situation that already existed and became the thing the situation needed. Produce a resolution. Fort Belvedere was sold after the abdication. George VI had no attachment to it and found it unsuitably associated with the circumstances of his accession. The new owners renovated it. Later it passed through several sets of hands. The late 20th century it had been restored again, and was occupied in the private way that good country houses with complicated histories are. occupied by people who appreciate the architecture without necessarily wanting to inhabit the associations. Garden that Edward had cut back with his own hands is still there. The grounds that Wallis had walked in on summer weekends in 1934 and 1935, before anyone had said abdication publicly, before anyone had printed anything in a British newspaper, before the constitutional crisis had been named as such, are still there. The house contains no museum of what happened in it. It is a private home. History it holds is the kind that houses absorb and do not advertise. People who have lived in it since 1936 have mostly been able to occupy it without being particularly disturbed by what it knows. Fort Belvedere that Edward had made his own by 1934 was everything Buckingham Palace was not. It was a small castle, or more precisely a Gothic folly enlarged into a Gothic fantasy, set in woodland in Windsor Great Park with views across the landscape that had a specific quality of privacy, of being somehow separated from the official world by more than the distance between it and the palace. Edward had been given it by his father in 1930 and had renovated it with the enthusiasm of a man who had found, for the first time in his life, space he could actually call his own. He had cleared scrub from the garden itself, working alongside his men in the early mornings. He had modernized the plumbing and upgraded the kitchens. He had furnished it according to his own taste, ran to comfortable rather than ceremonial, to the casual international style of the wealthy Anglo-American world rather than the formal, Draudian stiffness of the official royal houses. He played the bagpipes at Fort Belvedere for no better reason than that he had learned to play them and liked to practice. Sound of a future king piping on a weekend morning in the grounds of his folly became one of the details that biographers have used consistently to suggest that he was unconventional. He was. The unconventionality was real and it was genuine, and in certain respects it was admirable. He was genuinely less stuffed than older royals in ways that the public could perceive and found appealing. He visited the South Wales coalfields in 1936 after his accession and stood among the unemployed miners and said that something must be done, meaning that the unemployment and deprivation he was looking at was not acceptable. The remark was politically improper, because a constitutional monarch is not supposed to make statements that commit the government to a policy the government has not chosen. It was human and people responded to it as human. He had genuinely noticed things that his more official relatives appeared not to notice, or appeared to notice in ways that didn't translate into words people could hear. He had travelled. He had met veterans of the Great War in their reduced circumstances, miners and factory workers and the unemployed. He had not responded to those encounters with the fixed social smile that said the right things and felt nothing. He had been changed by them, had at least been changed enough that the change was visible. But the unconventionality had another side that was less appealing, and that his public image had never had to carry, because the British press maintained its careful deference to royal privacy. He was, in the word that his private secretary Tommy Lascelles used in private documents that would not be published for decades, actually ready to sacrifice truth to his personal likes or dislikes. He lied to the people who worked for him, not in the grand strategic way of politicians, but in the small and frequent way of someone who found the truth of his own intentions inconvenient. The truth was that he didn't want to do the thing he was supposed to do. He was late, consistently and without apology. He lost state papers and left others open in rooms where they should not have been. He avoided the boring work of monarchy, which is most of the work of monarchy, with the practiced ease of a man who had been avoiding things he didn't want to do since childhood. He had a gift for charm that was real but that concealed, from those who hadn't been watching long enough, a certain shallowness in the application. He could be warm and engaging and present, and then he could switch it off and move to the next person, with the efficiency of someone for whom warmth, tool. His previous relationships with women, particularly with Freda Dudley Ward, who had been close to him for more than 15 years, and who was cut off abruptly when Wallis had replaced her in his attention, suggested that his capacity for sustained loyalty was conditional on there being no alternative that he preferred. Freda Dudley Ward had been, for most of the 1920s, the emotional centre of Edward's private life. She was married, which was common in the kind of relationship that a prince of that era would typically pursue. She had a quality of steadiness and emotional clarity that Edward needed. She had cared for him, and she had managed him, and she had understood the particular intelligence of a woman who has thought carefully about what she is doing. exactly what she was involved in and what its limits were. When it ended because Edward stopped returning her calls. No conversation, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the years. She tried to reach him by telephone on several occasions, and was told by the palace operator politely that the prince was unavailable. Eventually she stopped trying. The accounts of people who knew Freda Dudley Ward describe her as devastated and then angry and then, over time, philosophical. The people who knew Edward describe it as characteristic. Thelma Furness's exit was faster and similarly abrupt. Wallis' replacement was complete within weeks of Thelma's return from New York in March 1934. Thelma had been invited to Fort Belvedere for weekends and to Wallis's for lunch, and who had considered both of these people her friends, found herself simply no longer on the list. What Wallis was giving Edward that these other women had not managed to provide permanently is the question that his biographers have been circling since the 1930s. The theory that she had a physical hold on him through some technique learned in Shanghai is the least defensible and most widely repeated. The theory that she had power over him because of the specific emotional configuration of character, because he needed to feel chosen by someone who was not simply dazzled by his rank, and who applied to him the same focused, managing intelligence she applied to everything, is more interesting and more plausible. He was, in ways that his public image obscured, man who had been surrounded since birth by people whose primary relationship with him was institutional. Parents had loved him with the cool correctness that Victorian parenting in a royal household produced. His officials managed him. Women who surrounded him, as the Prince of Wales, were attracted to his glamour and his position. He had spent his entire adult life as the most admired man in any room, and the specific experience of being admired for rank rather than for self is one that those who've had it describe as profoundly isolating. Wallis did not flatter him in the expected way. She teased him. She told him what she thought. She managed his preferences with a directness that other people around him found startling. She corrected his dinner orders. She told him when his clothes were wrong. She argued with him about things she knew better about than he did and won the arguments. She treated him less like a prince than like a man she was responsible for, and the experience of being someone's genuine responsibility, opposed to someone's formal duty, was one that Edward had apparently never quite had before. Letters he wrote to her during their years together, letters that were eventually purchased at auction and published in part, of a quality that his biographers tend to describe with some care because the terms are unusual. He wrote to her as a supplicant. He addressed her in terms that expressed need rather than desire, dependence rather than choice. He wrote in the mid-1930s, someone who could not fully function without knowing that she was there, and that she had found him adequate. This was love is a philosophical rather than a historical question. The observable fact was that the need was genuine. It was larger than anything his previous relationships had contained. It had by 1935 reached a degree of intensity that made the question of marriage not a future aspiration but an immediate plan. Wallis's feelings were, by the accounts of people closest to her, more mixed. She was fond of Edward. She was also aware of what she had and what it might become, and what it would cost her, and the awareness was not, on every day, comfortable. She wrote to Ernest Simpson in 1935 with a directness about her own uncertainty that suggests the romantic narrative, in which she was pursuing the king as deliberately as he was pursuing her, was not the full story. She was being carried somewhere by a current she had not generated, and she was managing the current with the skill she brought to every current. Management is not the same as choice. The George V who died at Sandringham in January 1936 had done so while harbouring a clear assessment of what coming. He had told the Archbishop of Canterbury that he prayed God his eldest son would never marry and have children so that the crown would pass to Albert. He had reportedly told Lord Dawson of Penn, his physician, during one of his last coherent conversations, that after his death, Boy would ruin himself within 12 months. His calculation was nearly correct. Edward's accession on January 20, 1936, greeted publicly with warmth and privately with a specific kind of apprehension that the people who felt it were not in a position to express publicly. The new king was popular, and the monarchy needed him to be popular, and the first weeks of the reign were filled with the gestures of a modern, accessible sovereign that the cameras recorded and the newspapers celebrated. Behind that public surface, officials who were now responsible for the daily machinery of the monarchy were dealing with a different reality. The red boxes, leather-bound cases containing state papers that a constitutional sovereign is expected to read and sign and return in a timely fashion, came a source of quiet institutional anxiety within weeks of the accession. Papers were not returned. Boxes were left in rooms they should not have been left in. The Foreign Office began receiving anxious inquiries from palace officials about documents that had been sent for the king's attention and had not reappeared in a state that suggested careful reading. This was not new behaviour. Sells had documented it during his time as the Prince of Wales's secretary in the 1920s. What was new was that the prince was now the king. Papers in those boxes were now matters of genuine constitutional importance. Casualness with which they were being treated was alarming in ways that the earlier behaviour had merely suggested. Rhineland provided the first clear indication of how alarming it might become. German forces reoccupied the Rhineland on March 7, 1936. Was a direct violation of both the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties. It was a military action. Question before the British and French governments was whether to respond with sufficient force to reverse it. Response that most military planners estimated would have succeeded at that moment because Germany was not yet ready for a full European war. To acquiesce in the violation and accept what followed. The British cabinet debated the question. The Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, inclined toward a firmer response. Baldwin was cautious. Public opinion in Britain was not prepared for military engagement. The situation was genuinely difficult. Into this difficulty, the new king introduced his private view. He told several people, including cabinet ministers and foreign officials who had access to him through official channels, no action should be taken against the Rhineland remilitarization. He felt that the occupation should be accommodated. Germany's legitimate interests in its own territory should be recognized. Confrontation over the Rhineland was more likely to precipitate the European war, everyone feared, than to prevent it. Views were not unusual in British political life in 1936. There was a substantial body of informed opinion that shared them. Made the king's expression of these views constitutionally problematic was that he was the king. He was expressing them to people who were responsible for making the decision, rather than discussing it. The German government knew he held them. The German ambassador Ribbentrop, as would become clear only later from the captured foreign ministry files, was keeping Berlin informed of the king's dispositions. Dispatch from 1936, Ribbentrop reported that the king's friendly disposition toward Germany would, he believed, have some influence on British foreign policy, and recommended that the Nazi government cultivate this channel. He was treating the British king as an asset. Baldwin and the Foreign Office were aware of the German assessment before the year was out. The awareness added a dimension to the developing marriage crisis that the marriage crisis alone would not have generated. When Baldwin travelled to Fort Belvedere in October 1936 for the first of his direct conversations with the king about the Simpson situation, carrying with him not only the cabinet's view about the constitutional impropriety of the proposed marriage, but also an assessment, shared by the Foreign Office and by British intelligence, of a man whose political reliability was not established and whose sympathies in the direction of Britain's most dangerous potential adversary were a matter of documented record. He could not say this publicly. He could not say, in the House of Commons or in the press, that the king needed to go, partly because he was effectively a German intelligence asset and partly because people responsible for British foreign policy could not with confidence predict which direction his informal lobbying would push them next. Constitutional conventions did not permit it. The diplomatic consequences would have been severe. Public would not have understood it in terms that didn't produce panic. So he said what he could say. The proposed marriage was constitutionally untenable. That the Church of England could not accept it. The Dominion governments would not support it, and that the Prime Minister's advice was that the king must choose between the marriage and the throne. Edward chose the marriage, or more precisely, Edward chose to describe himself as choosing the marriage, because the romantic framing was the one available to him that preserved what dignity remained. Because whatever else can be said about Edward Windsor, he understood a narrative when he was offered one. The German government, for its part, believed what Ribbentrop believed, that the abdication had been engineered. Ribbentrop stated this explicitly at various points, before and after the war, with a consistency that was self-serving but was not, on the available evidence, simply wrong. The marriage crisis was real. Constitutional objections were real. The political calculation that used those real objections to achieve a departure that the government had, wanting to manage for rather more specific reasons than it publicly stated, was also real. These things are not mutually exclusive. Institution can be genuinely horrified by the prospect of a twice-divorced American queen, and simultaneously glad to have a means of addressing a problem that the romance conveniently obscured. The palace was both. Baldwin was both. The romantic narrative that the abdication speech installed as the official version of events was true enough, in its specific limited way, to serve the function it was designed to serve. The story of Edward's German sympathies does not begin with Wallis Simpson and does not begin in 1936. Begins in the early 1930s, in the drawing rooms and dinner tables of a section of the British ruling class that had drawn certain conclusions from Great War and intended never to repeat the experience. Between 1914 and 1918, approximately 700,000 British soldiers were killed. Number sits in British cultural memory like a stone in a field, something too heavy to move and too present to ignore. Generation that came of age in the 1920s and 1930s had grown up knowing men who had died, and men who had come back broken, and men who had never quite reconnected to ordinary life after what they had done and seen. The determination that this would not happen again was not confined to pacifists or to the political left. It ran through the upper classes, through the military families, through the governing establishment, something close to an obligation. Edward, Prince of Wales, was 30 when the war ended. He had served in a largely ceremonial capacity on the Western Front, and had been frustrated enough by his exclusion from the genuine danger that he occasionally went forward of his own ranks. Authority to see the lines more closely. His equerry, Alan Lascelles, who would later serve as his private secretary, and who would document his givings about Edward's fitness for the throne, in terms more pointed than any official document of the period, said that Edward's behavior on those occasions made them fear for his life. Because it was brave, but because it was careless, in the way of a man whose principal driver was the desire to feel something, rather than the desire to accomplish anything. He came out of the war with his generation's visceral aversion to repetition and with something else. Specific personal attachment to Germany that drew on family as much as politics. British royal family had been the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha until 1917. George V changed the name to Windsor specifically because the German name was untenable during a war with Germany. Family's German roots ran deep. Edward's cousins and second cousins, and the extended web of European royalty to which the Windsors were connected, substantially German. The Kaiser, whose war Britain had just fought, was his father's first cousin. Psychic adjustment required to regard Germany as an enemy required the family to regard a large portion of its own genealogy as the enemy. The adjustment was never entirely clean. Leopold von Hosch arrived in London as German ambassador in November 1932. He was a professional diplomat rather than a political appointment, a man with a long career in the German Foreign Service who had served as ambassador to Paris and who brought to London the skills of a career civil servant rather than the ideology of the coming regime. He was sophisticated, cosmopolitan, well-connected in London society, and he made it his business to cultivate relationships with the people who mattered in British public life. Edward, Prince of Wales, was among those he cultivated. The relationship was personal as much as official. Hosch attended the same parties as Edward, moved through the same houses in the country, was received by the same hostesses, found each other easy to talk to in the way that well-travelled people, with a shared sense of how international politics actually worked, sometimes do. Edward trusted von Hosch in the way he rarely trusted his own officials. The specific openness that he showed to people who did not serve him, and who therefore had no reason to manage him. Hosch did not serve Hitler's interest in the way that his successors would. He was a conservative nationalist of the old German type, man who found the Nazi government's methods distasteful even when he represented them, who functioned during his London years as something of a moderating conduit between British opinion and Berlin. He died in London in April 1936, a heart attack, and was succeeded by Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was not a moderating influence of any kind. Difference between von Hosch and Ribbentrop is the difference between the Germany that a certain kind of British conservative could live with, Germany that was actually building itself in those years. Von Hosch was the Germany of Bismarck's tradition, nationalist and assertive but comprehensible within the European state system. Ribbentrop was the Germany of the party of the Nuremberg rallies, bureaucratic machinery of exclusion and persecution that was by 1936 well advanced. Edward's relationship with the German embassy continued without disruption. Through the transition between these two men is one of the things the palace found difficult to explain and mostly chose not to. Ribbentrop arrived in London in October 1936 as ambassador, having previously served as Hitler's special envoy for disarmament discussions and as the negotiator of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. He was also by 1936 bringing 19 carnations to Wallis Simpson on each of his regular visits to her, number that was later reported by palace gossip, and that has become one of the odder details of the period. This was an intelligence operation, a social courtesy, a genuine personal affection. Some combination of all three has been debated without resolution. The number 19 is the detail that stays in the mind, because no one has ever satisfactorily explained it. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement is itself significant in this account. It was negotiated without consulting France, breach of the Stresa Front agreements that Britain had signed only months before. It allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35 of the Royal Navy's tonnage. France was furious. Foreign Office was divided on whether it had been wise. Edward was, by the accounts of British officials who discussed it with him, enthusiastic about it, having expressed views about the importance of accommodating German naval ambitions that went beyond the position of even the sympathetic members of the cabinet. His views on Germany were not a secret among those who needed to know them. German ambassadors' dispatches to Berlin are among the clearest evidence of this. Von Ribbentrop's reports, which survive in the Marburg files, record conversations with Edward in which the king expressed opinions about the inadvisability of confronting Germany that would have been inappropriate in a private individual and was something more alarming in a reigning monarch. Dispatches describe him as extraordinarily friendly toward Germany and as expressing hope for a friendly German-English relationship. Describe him discussing the possibility of an eventual Anglo-German alliance with an openness that German officials found encouraging enough to report at length. These were official German Foreign Ministry documents. They were not fabricated, cross-referenced with other reports from the same period, and consistent with what British officials were separately noting about the king's political views. The question of how much weight to give them rests not on whether Edward said these things but on how to interpret what he meant by, and how closely his expressed opinions aligned with any genuine intention to act on them. Tommy Lascelles, who had served as the Prince of Wales's assistant private secretary from 1920 to 1929 before resigning in a state of documented alarm about his principal's character, had written a memorandum after his resignation that captured the nature of his concerns with clinical precision. He did not write about German sympathies because the German question had not yet acquired its 1936 shape. He wrote about something more fundamental. Man who lacked the discipline to do the work of a constitutional monarch, capable of genuine kindness and genuine charm, but who was incapable of the steady impersonal application of duty that the job required. Personal conduct in the realm of his romantic life showed a specific quality of disregard for the consequences his behavior visited on people. Lascelles returned to royal service as assistant private secretary to George V in 1935, then served in the same capacity for Edward V. The experience of watching a man whose private character he had documented in 1929 ascend to throne confirmed rather than revised his earlier assessment. He watched Edward neglect the red boxes, the official state papers that a constitutional monarch is required to read and sign. He watched him leave them in places where they could be seen, occasionally locked, occasionally not, occasionally in locations accessible to people who should not have had access to state documents. Gells's private account of this, written much later and published after his death, precise about the specific instances and deeply uncomfortable in what it implies about the attitude to official duty that produced them. Rhineland crisis of March 1936 gave Edward an opportunity to make his views about Germany actionable in a way that his private conversations had. On March 7, German troops crossed into the demilitarized zone, the belt of German territory, along the French and Belgian borders that had been kept clear of military presence under the Versailles Treaty and the later Locarno agreements. The breach of those agreements was a serious matter. France wanted a firm response. Britain's military chiefs considered the options the cabinet debated. Edward met with the German ambassador on March 18, 11 days after the troops crossed the border. content of that meeting was reported in the German records. Edward told von Ribbentrop that he considered a firm British response to the Rhineland move inadvisable and that the best course was accommodation rather than confrontation. He said this to the ambassador of the country that had committed the breach. He said it, in other words, to the side that benefited from British inaction, which is a very different thing from expressing a private opinion to his own officials. British cabinet chose not to respond militarily to the Rhineland remilitarization. France, without British support, was not prepared to act alone. Germany was not pushed back. The military consensus stated afterward, when it was safe to state it, Germany in March 1936 was not ready for a military confrontation, and that a firm response at that moment might have stopped the subsequent sequence of events at a very early stage. The consensus also acknowledged that the German military's post-war statements about the fragility of their position in March 1936 were self-serving, but this is a qualification rather than a refutation. Clear is that Edward's conversation with Ribbentrop on March 18 was known to British officials, documented in the German records, and represented a direct communication to a foreign government of views contrary to the developing position of his own government. It was not the act of a man who understood, or who chose to honor, the constitutional limits of a sovereign's personal communications on matters of foreign policy. Stanley Baldwin was well aware of all of this by the time the marriage question became a public crisis in November 1936. His handling of the abdication, which later historians have sometimes characterized as primarily about the marriage, in fact, a multi-layered political operation in which the marriage was the publicly presentable surface and the German connection was one of the things buried underneath. He had been Prime Minister through the most alarming months of Edward's German sympathetic conduct. He had read the intelligence reports. He had received the Foreign Office's concerns. He had observed the King's handling of the red boxes and his conversations with foreign diplomats and his expressed views on the European situation. Baldwin was a cautious man and a skilled parliamentary operator, and he understood that the German question could not be used publicly as a reason to remove a king. The constitutional machinery did not contain provisions for removing a monarch on grounds of incompatible political views. Attempting to use it for that purpose would have created a crisis far larger than the one he was managing. The marriage question was available, real, was constitutionally clear and could be stated in newspapers. He used it. This was not a lie. Marriage question was genuinely impossible under the constitutional framework. The Church of England's objection was genuine. Dominion's refusals were genuine. The government's assessment that a morganatic marriage was not available under British constitutional practice, genuine. Baldwin used a real reason, which happened also to be the reason he could state. The reasons he could not state were not less real for being unstated. The effect of using the stateable reason while leaving the unstateable ones in the files was to create a public record that was permanently incomplete, and the incompleteness served everyone except the public. It served Baldwin. Conduct the removal without having to explain the German question. It served the palace. Could tell the romantic story rather than the intelligence story. It served Edward, who could broadcast a speech about love rather than about the documented evidence of his conversations with foreign governments. And it served Wallis, specific and deeply ironic way that making her the public reason gave her a starring role in a drama that would define her for the rest of her life, while the actual reasons why the palace needed Edward gone were filed in cabinets that would remain closed for decades. German records that are most damaging to the romantic narrative were captured at Marburg in 1945. British documents that are most revealing about the domestic political calculation were released over several decades. The relevant Foreign Office papers coming into public access in tranches that allowed the story to be assembled but not assembled all at once. Full academic account has been available since the 1990s. It has not, in any meaningful sense, placed the romantic narrative in general circulation. The romantic narrative is stickier. Has had 80 years of film and television and authorized biography to establish its grooves. It has had the physical presence, 65 of those years, of the Queen Mother, whose continued existence was itself an argument for the version of events in which she was the heroic survivor and Wallis was the thing that had happened to her. Competing with 80 years of managed story with a set of German foreign ministry documents requires a kind of sustained public attention that the subject has not always found, and that the palace has never encouraged. If you're watching this far into the story, you already know this channel doesn't hand you the comfortable version. Subscribe if you haven't. Share the George V died on January 20th, 1936 at Sandringham at 11:55 at night. Official bulletins reported that his life was moving peacefully to its close, which was accurate in the sense that his physician Lord Dawson had administered an injection of morphine and cocaine into the king's jugular vein, evening to hasten the end. Lord Dawson made a note of this in his diary, which was deposited with the Wellcome Institute, and from which the relevant passage was quoted by Francis Donaldson's biographer Kenneth Rose many years later. The note confirmed that the death, which was announced as natural, been managed for reasons that included the convenience of the morning newspapers rather than the king's comfort alone. Fact about the management of the death of one king sits usefully alongside the subsequent story of the management of the departure of another. Edward was 41 when his father died. He had been Prince of Wales for 26 years, more than half his life. He had carried out tours, opened things, attended events, made speeches, and had been received everywhere with the specific adorations that his charm and his visible warmth and accessibility had generated in crowds. He had also spent 26 years waiting for a role that was entirely without preparation in the sense mattered. There was no way to rehearse being king except by being king. First weeks of his reign were managed with the public expressions of duty that the formal transition required. He attended the accession council. He gave the formal speeches. He appeared at the state occasions with the measured bearing of a man who understood that he was being watched by people who were assessing whether the promise of the Prince of Wales was going to be fulfilled by the king. Assessments in the first weeks were cautiously positive. He was attentive in public. He was warm. He had the quality of appearing genuinely interested in the people he met. George V had not had to the same degree, and which his officials noted as an asset. Private picture began to assert itself against the public one. The red boxes did not get done. This is the detail that appears first in the private accounts of the reign, and that was noticed within weeks of the accession, not months. The system by which official papers moved through the royal household had operated on a schedule under George V that everyone in the machinery of government had adjusted to. Papers went in, signed papers came back. The system had a rhythm, and the rhythm had consequences. Unsigned documents sat. Decisions waited. Officials who needed the royal engagement to proceed with work could not proceed. Edward's relationship with the boxes was immediately different. They were returned late, incompletely engaged with, sometimes apparently unopened. Wigram, the palace's private secretary, who had served George V and was transitioning to the new reign, noted the situation early and with the careful language of palace memos that meant what it said without saying everything it meant. Edward's own appointed private secretary, Alec Hardinge, was more direct in his private diary. Hardinge was a man whose disposition toward formality and constitutional correctness was the disposition that the position required, and his new employer's attitude to the work of the position was a daily source of difficulty that he recorded with precision. Wallis was at York House, the London residence where Edward had lived as Prince of Wales, with a frequency that Hardinge also noted. Access she had to the domestic environment in which official papers were handled was not, in Hardinge's judgment, appropriate. It is a judgment that has been contested by people who consider it prudish or classist, but it had a concrete dimension beyond the social one. State papers in the possession of a constitutional monarch have a security classification that requires controlled access. Access was not controlled in the way the classification required. Rhineland crisis of March 1936 has already been discussed in terms of Edward's conversation with Ribbentrop. Domestic dimension of his response to it also deserves attention. The British government's military chiefs were assessing the options available for a response to the German troops crossing into the demilitarized zone. The question of whether Britain should support French military action, should offer diplomatic pressure, or should effectively do nothing was live and being actively discussed. Edward received the Foreign Office papers on the situation. He received the military assessments. He received the diplomatic cables. He then communicated views to the German ambassador that were at odds with the government's developing position. Was not the behavior of a constitutional monarch operating within the conventions of his role? Those conventions are clear. Monarch is informed, the monarch is consulted, the monarch advises and is advised. Monarch does not communicate independent positions to foreign governments that contradict the positions of the government he serves. Conventions exist because a constitutional monarchy cannot function as both a constitutional limit on government and a competing foreign policy. Actor Edward's conversation with Ribbentrop was the latter, and his officials knew it. Summer of 1936 was the period in which the circles that needed to know the situation had largely reached their conclusions. Hardinge was alarmed. Sells, by then back in royal service, was alarmed. Walter Monckton, Edward's closest legal advisor and the man who would serve as go-between during the abdication crisis, was aware of the dimensions of the problem and was attempting to manage Edward's conduct in the direction of the conventions without being able to require it. Baldwin had been briefed on the full picture. The Austrian trip that August, Edward and Wallis joined a yachting party in the Adriatic that attracted extensive foreign press coverage and almost no British newspaper coverage due to the informal agreement among proprietors, was another instance of the pattern. The photographs of them together, widely published in American and European papers, showed a king and his companion in circumstances that made the nature of their relationship obvious. Anyone looking. The British public, whose newspapers were not running the photographs, continued in a state of managed ignorance that was not exactly deception and was not exactly honest. Autumn brought the crisis to its operational phase. Hardinge wrote a letter to Edward on November 13, 1936, warning him in explicit terms that the government was aware of the situation and that it was approaching a point at which public management would fail. The letter advised him to send Wallis abroad immediately. Edward received the letter, was enraged by it, and showed it to Wallis. The letter was not taken as advice. It was taken as the evidence that the machinery had turned against him, and this perception, accurate in its assessment of the direction of the machinery, if not in its characterization of the machinery's motives, hardened his determination. The events of November and December ran with the speed of something that had been held back too long. The Bishop of Bradford on December 1, Yorkshire Post on December 1 and 2, the London papers on December 3, the cabinet discussions, the Dominion consultations, were already done in fact, if not in final form. The morganatic proposal's rejection, Wallis's departure for France, the public statements, abdication on December 10. The night of December 11 was the night Edward broadcast, and the night he said goodbye to the household at Windsor Castle. The accounts of the goodbye given by people who were present are consistent in their detail. He moved through the rooms with the composure of a man who had made his decision and was past the point at which composure required effort. He shook hands. He said the right things to the staff. He thanked the people who had served him. He was warm in the specific way he was always warm with individuals in close proximity, quality that had made his public appearances genuinely popular, and that had never resolved the tension between the performance of warmth and the demands of institutional duty. He left Windsor in the early hours of December 12. The car took him to Portsmouth. The destroyer HMS Fury was waiting. Crossed the Channel in the dark, arriving in France in the morning, and drove to Schloss Enzersfeld in Austria, house belonging to Kitty de Rothschild, where he would wait for Wallis's divorce to become final. He was not permitted to speak to Wallis by telephone during the period of the Decree Nisi becoming the Decree Absolute, on the advice of lawyers who explained that any evidence of their continued relationship during the intervening period could potentially be used to challenge the divorce on grounds of collusion. This prohibition was honored for approximately a month before the loneliness of the separation overwhelmed the legal caution. They spoke by telephone. The lawyers noted the risk and managed it. He spent 5 months in Austria and then in France, waiting for June 3. He followed the British press when he could obtain it. He received visitors. He wrote letters. He corresponded with the palace about the terms of his departure in a correspondence that was handled through Monckton and that covered financial questions, title questions, and the conditions under which he might eventually return to Britain. The financial settlement was completed. Title question was not settled to his satisfaction. The conditions of return were never clearly established in the form he wanted. He did not go back to England for 5 years. When he did go back in September 1939, because a war had started, and he had presented himself to the War Office for whatever assignment they considered appropriate. The assignment they considered appropriate, eventually, was the governorship of the Bahamas. He had wanted something in Europe. He had wanted something close enough to the action that his energy and his knowledge could be of use. What he got was Nassau. Decade between his departure from England in December 1936 and his departure from the Bahamas at the end of the war in 1945 was the decade in The irreversibility of his situation became fully clear to him. The early years of exile had retained a quality of temporariness, sense that circumstances might shift, that a role might be found, that the distance between himself and the institution he had left was a matter of current arrangement rather than permanent condition. By 1945 that quality was gone. The institution had survived and grown stronger without him. Brother had been king through 6 years of war, and had become exactly the symbol that the war and the institution needed. Queen Mother had become the figure of popular love, that she would remain for 60 years. Niece Elizabeth was being prepared to be the next monarch. There was no slot in this arrangement for a former king with a complicated wartime, poured and a wife the palace had never received. He was 51 when the war ended. He had 37 years to live. He spent them in Paris, in New York, on Long Island, on the Riviera, at golf clubs, at dinner parties, at the occasional official function where his presence was acceptable, in the house at the Bois de Boulogne where the garden was kept to Wallis's standard, and the dining room was laid for 12, and the social world that had assembled from the materials available to them continued to function, diminishing gradually as all such worlds do when the people who sustain them age and the culture that sustained the world moves on. He had wanted to be useful. He had wanted, in the years of the war and in the years after it, be given something that matched the scale of his capacity and his knowledge and the accumulated experience of 26 years of public life. Across every part of the world that the British Empire then touched, he was not given it. He was given was the title and the garden and the evenings at the Bois de Boulogne house, and the campaign about the HRH title and the knowledge. People who had managed his departure were still managing his place in the story. He died on May 28, 1972, house in the Bois de Boulogne, of throat cancer. The Queen had visited him 10 days before. He was wearing his medals and had stood at the window to watch her car arrive. He died that night in his own room with Wallis beside him. Dispatches from the British Embassy in Paris that reported his death to the Foreign Office, released in the years since, are brief and correct. Note the time of death, the arrangements for the body's transport to England, the coordination with the palace on the funeral arrangements. They are the dispatches of a professional diplomatic service handling a logistical situation. They describe a man whose relationship with the institution was managed to the end by the institution's methods. Stone at Frogmore does not say what he gave up or what he chose, or what the palace spent decades managing in the files that are now available to researchers who look for them. It says his name and the dates and his rank. Royal Highness the Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, Duke of Windsor, King Edward the VIII. Last 5 words were added after his death, in the one gesture of formal acknowledgement that the institution made. He had been king for 10 months. He had alarmed everyone who worked with him. He had communicated with foreign governments in ways his own government could not sanction. He had neglected the formal obligations of the role in ways that accumulated into a permanent record of his unsuitability for it. He had loved a woman the institution found impossible to receive. He had broadcast a speech that told the part of the truth that was available to him. That was enough of the truth to be remembered as the whole. The rest is in the archive, filed correctly, available to the researchers who know where to look, and waiting, as inconvenient truths generally wait, version that most people are telling to use them up. The press silence that held through most of 1936 was one of the stranger features of the crisis. British newspapers had known about Edward's relationship with Wallis Simpson for more than a year before the Bishop of Bradford's speech opened the floodgates in December. American newspapers had been reporting it openly. European papers had covered the Mediterranean cruise in detail. People who subscribed to Time magazine, or who had American relatives, or who had access to foreign newspapers at their clubs had known for months that the story existed. The British newspapers themselves had known all of this, and had printed none of it. Reasons were multiple, and none of them were entirely honourable. The major newspaper proprietors, men like Lord Beaverbrook of the Daily Express and Lord Rothermere of the Daily Mail, had their own reasons for maintaining royal goodwill. Editorial consensus, influenced by the proprietor's wishes and by an informal tradition of deference to palace sensitivities that had no legal basis but had considerable practical force, was that the king's private life was not a matter for public discussion unless the palace indicated. Otherwise, the palace had indicated nothing of the kind. The newspapers held back. Silence served the palace's purposes in the short term and harmed everyone's interests in the longer one, because it meant that when the story finally broke, it did so without the context that months of reporting would have provided. British public received a fully formed crisis with no preparation. The king wanted to marry a woman. The woman was unacceptable. Choice was between marriage and throne. The public had not been given the months of background that would have allowed them to form considered views. They received it as a shock, and some of them received it as a romantic tragedy, and neither of those responses served the complex reality. Bishop of Bradford was Alfred Blunt, a 60-year-old churchman with no particular reputation for controversy. Speech he gave at his diocesan conference on December 1st, 1936, about the king and the upcoming coronation was, most accounts that have examined it carefully, intended to be a private pastoral rebuke rather than a public intervention. He said he wished the king gave more visible signs of his awareness of his need for divine grace. He was referring almost certainly to what the Church of England's inner circles understood about the Simpson situation. He was not expecting to be reported beyond his diocese. Yorkshire Post reported it. The regional press followed. By December 3, London newspapers had concluded that the embargo was broken and were printing the story they had been sitting on for a year. British newsrooms in the first week of December 1936 had the air of places that have been waiting a very long time to do a very large job and have finally been given permission. Baldwin held another conversation with the king on December 2nd. He had already rejected the morganatic marriage proposal, having taken it to the Dominion governments and received their consistent refusals. Canvassed cabinet opinion and found no support for any constitutional arrangement that would permit the marriage to proceed. He told the king that the choice was marriage and abdication, or the crown and no marriage. Edward had by this point had several weeks in which to consult his advisers, his friends, and Wallis herself. His friend Walter Monckton, lawyer and a man of remarkable personal loyalty, served as the informal go-between in the negotiations that the abdication required. Monckton carried messages, arranged meetings, and provided the legal framework within which the departure could be organized. He was devoted to Edward in a way that other people around the king had ceased to be, carried out his role with a steadiness that the situation needed. Wallis had left England on December 3rd, travelling by car to the coast and then to France, accompanied by Lord Perry Brownlow, a friend of Edward's and a detective. Journey was described at the time as flight, because it partially was. She had been advised that her continued presence in Britain was not helping the situation. The press attention around her was making the constitutional crisis more acute. Whatever happened next would be easier to manage if she was not on British soil when it happened. She did not go willingly, in the sense that she went without wanting to. She understood that she was being managed out of the room in which decisions were being made about her future, and she managed the experience of being managed with a composure that the people around her found remarkable. Told Edward she would give him up. She wrote him a letter saying so. She told him publicly, in a statement released to the press on December 8, she was willing to withdraw entirely if that would resolve the crisis. Edward received her letter and her public statement and continued on the path toward abdication. Is the element of the official story that is most often left unexamined. Wallis tried to stop it and he didn't stop. Romantic narrative gives him agency and gives her desire, but the actual sequence of events shows a man who had decided and a woman who was trying too late to undecide it for him and who was not listened to. On December 10, 1936, Edward Fye signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere. He was witnessed by his three brothers, Albert, Henry, and George. Signing was brief and formal. Albert, who would become George VI within hours, was pale. He had not wanted this. He had been raised as the spare backup, the one who would take over only in the event that the primary sequence failed. He had built his life around the clear understanding that the primary sequence would not fail. It had now failed, and he would spend the rest of his life carrying the consequences. Abdication was formally approved by Parliament the following morning, and Edward ceased to be king at that moment. He would not broadcast his farewell until that evening. He spent the afternoon at Windsor, preparing the speech that his friend Winston Churchill had helped him revise and polish. Churchill had been one of the very few public figures to openly support the king during the crisis, having briefly and ill-fatedly tried to delay the process with a call for more time to consider alternatives. The attempt had been poorly received by Parliament and by much of the public, and Churchill had retreated. But he had helped with the speech, and his fingerprints are visible in the quality of its prose. The broadcast went out at 10 o'clock in the evening. Edward sat before a BBC microphone at Windsor Castle and spoke with the measured clarity of a man who has prepared very carefully for a moment he cannot get through any other way. He said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. He said he wished his brother well. He said he had made his decision freely and that no one had persuaded him of it. He said nothing about Germany. He said nothing about the intelligence assessments. He said nothing about the concerns that had been building in the palace and the Foreign Office for 12 months and more. He gave the public the love story because the love story was what was available to him, and because the love story told the way he told it, true in the way that partial truths can be truer than complicated ones. He left England the following morning, crossing the Channel on a destroyer and travelling to Austria, where he would stay with friends and wait for the divorce proceedings for Wallis's marriage to Ernest to complete. She received his broadcast in Cannes and wept. She had wanted it to be otherwise. She felt about the fact that it wasn't. What she knew about the wider context of why it wasn't, she kept to herself for the rest of her life. He was now George VI. He chose the name George to make the point of continuity with his father as clearly as possible. Continuity was what the monarchy needed after a rupture of this kind, and because his own personality, steady, dutiful, without the celebrity of his brother or the specific kind of glamour, was better suited to embodiment than to performance. He was a man who would carry the burden because it was there, and because no one else could carry it, and that quality of unspectacular integrity turned out exactly what the institution needed for the next 15 years. His wife Elizabeth, now Queen Consort, less philosophical about the situation. She had not wanted this. She had said so repeatedly in private. She had been happy as Duchess of York. She had liked the life she had built with Bertie, the warmth of the private household, the relative normality of their daughter's childhood, space that being the Spare's wife provided in which to be a person rather than a symbol. All of that was gone now. Queen, and she would remain Queen Consort for 15 years, and then Queen Mother for 50 more. Every one of those 65 years would be lived in the knowledge that the woman who had married the man she still called the Duke was out in France carrying the name Windsor. She was not forgiving. No document in any archive suggests that she moved toward forgiveness. Official biographies that were written about her with her cooperation are discreet on the subject of Wallis, discreet in the way of documents that are managing an emotion rather than reflecting an absence of one. The private letters, accounts of people who knew her well, the occasional remark that slipped through the management, all point in the same direction. She hated Wallis Simpson with a consistency and a specificity that lasted 60 years and that she considered entirely justified. Whether it was justified is a question with more dimensions than the answer that was always available. The abdication had hurt her family. It had damaged her husband and killed him younger than he should have died, and forced her daughters into lives they hadn't been raised for. These were real injuries, but the woman she held responsible was neither the full cause of them, nor the thing her animosity had made of her. Palace's management of that animosity into the public record, its cultivation of the narrative in which the Queen Mother was the heroic survivor and Wallis was the agent of damage, was itself a form of the institutional dishonesty that the abdication had started. Morganatic marriage proposal was Edward's idea, and it was, in retrospect, the moment at which the outcome became inevitable. He raised it with Baldwin in October 1936, having had it outlined to him by his friend Esmond Harmsworth, son of Lord Rothermere of the Daily Mail. Possible solution. The idea was this: Wallis could become his wife but not his queen. She would hold a lesser title, not share his rank. Any children of the marriage would not be in the line of succession. It was a form of marriage that existed in several European royal traditions and had been used in various forms to permit royal marriages to people of unequal rank without disrupting the succession. Baldwin took the proposal seriously enough to consult the Dominions, which was required by the Statute of Westminster of 1931, to which any change to the rules of royal succession required the consent of the Dominion governments of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. He already knew what the answers would be. He had been in contact with Dominion officials through the preceding weeks and had a reasonably clear picture of the political terrain in each capital. He asked the formal questions anyway, both because the process required it and because having formal refusals from the Dominions gave him something he could show the king. The refusals came in promptly. All 5 dominions declined to support the morganatic marriage option. Grounds varied slightly by country, but the substance was consistent. The marriage to Wallis Simpson in any form was unacceptable. Canadian government under Mackenzie King was particularly clear on this. The Australian and New Zealand governments were equally firm. South Africa, whose domestic politics contained a significant Afrikaner nationalist component with no particular love for British royalty in general, found the proposal unacceptable on its own terms. The Irish Free State, which had been working its way toward effective independence from British constitutional arrangements for years, responded in terms that made clear it had no intention of supporting any position that would complicate the relationship between its government and the British Crown. Baldwin brought the Dominion responses to Edward and laid them out. Edward received them. He had understood on some level that this was the answer he was going to get. He had made the proposal not because he believed it would work, but because he needed to exhaust the available options before reaching the conclusion, was waiting at the end of them. Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was 72 in 1936 and had been Archbishop since 1928. He was a man of considerable political sophistication who had navigated the Church of England's relationship with the Crown through the later years. George V's reign with skill and discretion. His relationship with Edward V was never warm. He had observed the Prince of Wales through the 1920s and had formed views about his character that his official position required him to keep private, and he had kept them private. When the abdication crisis arrived in the autumn of 1936, he was one of the few figures in the establishment who had a clear position from the beginning. He believed Edward should abdicate. He had come to this view on grounds that went beyond the marriage question. Grounds that included his assessment of Edward's personal faith and his suitability for the role of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, constitutional position the monarch held in relation to the established church. A monarch who had shown little evidence of religious practice, who was proposing to marry a twice-divorced woman, and whose personal conduct the Archbishop considered incompatible with the symbolic requirements. Position was, in Lang's assessment, not a suitable king. The marriage question was, for Lang as for Baldwin, the available argument rather than the complete one. His handling of the public communication of the Church's position was politically adroit. He did not make a public statement during the crisis itself that would have forced a direct confrontation with the king or complicated Baldwin's management of the constitutional process. He allowed the constitutional process to run and the abdication to occur. Then, after the abdication, he made a radio broadcast. The broadcast went out on December 13, 1936, 2 days after the abdication. It was extraordinary in its severity. Lang described the late king's behavior as making his duties secondary to private happiness, as choosing personal desire over public duty. He spoke of a social circle that he characterized, without naming its members, as dangerous in its influences. He spoke of the standards of those whose ways are alien to the Christian principles of marriage, again without naming anyone specifically, without any real ambiguity about who he meant. The public reaction to Lang's broadcast was hostile in ways he had not fully anticipated. Criticism came from people who felt he was kicking a man who had already left, who was unable to respond, who had conducted himself with dignity in the formal moment of departure. Kipling's cousin wrote a brief verse that circulated widely. "Lord Archbishop, what a scold you are, and when your man is down, how bold you are." It caught something real. The timing of the broadcast, following the abdication by 48 hours, had the quality of a moral judgment delivered by someone who had waited until the outcome was settled for delivering it. Lang defended himself by pointing to his silence during the crisis itself, arguing that his restraint during the critical weeks had been appropriate and that his pastoral responsibility now required him to speak. It was not a dishonest argument, but the effect of the broadcast was to establish a public framing of the abdication as a moral failure rather than constitutional one, a framing that served the palace's purposes without the palace having to make the statement directly. Archbishop's role in the year following the abdication was also significant in the area of titles and rank. Decision about what titles the Windsors would hold was taken by the palace and the government during the winter of 1936-1937. Lang was part of the consultations. The decision that Wallis would not hold the title of Royal Highness was final by the time of the wedding in June 1937. Edward, who had been given the title Duke of Windsor and the style His Royal Highness, married to a woman who could not share his style. The official explanation offered at the time, and in subsequent years, was that the title Royal Highness was a dignity that had been given to Edward personally, as a grace rather than as a right, and that it could not be extended to his wife. Legal architecture of this argument has been disputed by several constitutional lawyers, both at the time and subsequently. Windsor solicitor's opinion, and the opinion of at least one of the lawyers consulted by Edward himself, the denial of the HRH title to Wallis had no clear legal basis. Edward had renounced the throne but not his royal status. Status as a royal prince remained. The convention that a wife takes her husband's rank and style was well established in English law and practice. Specific denial to Wallis required active decision-making on the part of the palace, not merely the application of existing rules. Active decision-maker was George VI, advised by the Queen Consort, advised by the Private Secretary, advised by the government. George VI was not a man who made decisions of this kind without consulting the people around him, and the people around him included his wife, had opinions about Wallis Simpson that were not subject to revision. The HRH denial was a punishment. It was designed as a punishment. Everyone involved knew it was designed as a punishment, including Edward, who spent the rest of his life attempting through correspondence and official channel and personal communication to have it reversed. He never succeeded. The coronation of George VI took place on May 12, 1937. It was organized under conditions of considerable pressure, because the original coronation had been planned for Edward and the machinery for it, the preparation, the rehearsals, the international guest list, already in place. Much of it could be adapted, the date remained the same. Ceremony proceeded with the adjustments that the change of king required. New king and queen were crowned together in a ceremony that the palace and the press managed with the emphasis on continuity and stability that institution needed after the disruption of the abdication. George VI was not the king anyone had expected to be crowned. He was shy where Edward had been charismatic, spoke with a stammer that he had worked for years to control, and that the pressure of the occasion made worse, and was genuinely frightened by the scale of what he had been given. His wife stood beside him with a composure that those who observed her closely described as not entirely natural, product of will rather than ease, but that conveyed to the watching public exactly the stability the situation demanded. Contrast with the absent Edward was managed in the coverage of the coronation. Edward had been popular. Crowds that had turned out for his public appearances as Prince of Wales had been genuinely enormous. His abdication had been received by a significant portion of the public as a romantic sacrifice. Romanticism had complicated the transition in ways the palace found difficult. Coverage of the coronation worked to shift the emotional identification from the abdicating king to his successor, transfer the public warmth that Edward had accumulated over 20 years to a man who had not had 20 years to accumulate it. It worked, in the end, because George VI was genuinely likable in the way that steady, dutiful, unperforming people often are when the public has been given adequate time to see them without the distorting lens of a crisis. It worked partly because of what happened between the abdication and the coronation, which was the German tour of October 1937, and what happened because of the German tour, which was the public understanding that the man who had abdicated for love had also, 10 months since, been photographed giving Nazi salutes at German factories and sitting with Hitler at Berchtesgaden. The love story was therefore not entirely the story. The public's readjustment of its emotional investment in Edward, gradual process by which the romantic hero of December 1936 became the embarrassing former king of the 1940s and 1950s, not primarily the palace's doing, it was primarily the Windsor's own. The decisions they made in the year after the abdication, decisions about Germany and about public statements and about the company they kept, did more to undermine the romantic narrative in popular feeling than anything the palace could have arranged. Palace simply managed the process as it went, ensuring that the coverage was framed in ways that served its purposes, and waited. Very good at waiting. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Cande, borrowed house in the Loire Valley belonging to Charles Badeau, an American naturalized French efficiency consultant whose social connections were more extensive than his reputation would later make comfortable. The house was beautiful. The ceremony was small. No member of the British royal family attended. The non-attendance was a deliberate signal and everyone present understood it as such. Herman Rogers, long-standing American friend of Wallis's, gave her away. The Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine, Church of England vicar from Durham, who had volunteered his services after the church's official position that a religious ceremony was inappropriate had left the couple without a clergyman, conducted the service. Bishop subsequently reprimanded him, and he was never given another Church of England living. He died in California in 1950, having spent the intervening years conducting occasional lectures about the wedding and trading on an association that had cost him his career. Wallis wore a dress by Mainbocher in the specific shade of blue that the designer had created for the occasion, and that was subsequently called Wallis blue in some accounts of the event, though the color reference has not persisted into common usage. The dress was not white, which was understood by everyone to be a statement of the facts. It was an extraordinarily well-made dress worn by a woman who understood precisely how she was going to be looked at and had made her choices accordingly. Edward wore mourning dress and a carnation, 42 years old, and had been out of Britain for 6 months. He would not be back for any meaningful period for 35 years. Ernest Simpson had married Mary Raffray by the time of the Château de Candé wedding. The marriage had taken place in London in the autumn of 1937, after his divorce from Wallis was finalised. Mary was the Washington friend, who had been a steady presence in the later years of the Simpsons' marriage, and the progression from Wallis's friend to Ernest's companion to Ernest's wife was accomplished with the minimum of public drama that Ernest's character made possible. He is a figure who receives less attention than he deserves in most accounts of the abdication. He was a man of genuine culture, a serious reader and a collector of modest means, built a life in London with Wallis that was by most accounts warm and well managed. He had watched his wife become the companion of the Prince of Wales with the specific quality of English composure that public school produces in men who have learned not to make scenes, and he had accommodated the situation for longer than most men would have. When the situation resolved itself, he got on with things. He told people on those occasions when the question of Wallis and Edward was raised, he bore neither of them any personal animosity. Whether this was entirely true is not verifiable, because he did not leave a memoir or a substantial correspondence that has been published. Accounts of people who knew him in the years after the abdication suggest a man who was getting on with his life rather than a man who had achieved genuine equanimity about it. He and Mary had a son. He continued in the shipping business. He died in 1958. Mary Raffray Simpson's experience of being married to a man who had been married to Wallis was not, by the available accounts, untroubled. Ghost of the previous wife was not easy to avoid in London social circles where everyone knew the story. The story had been very thoroughly told. She died in 1941 before Ernest. Causes that the brief accounts of her life that exist in the relevant reference sources describe with the vagueness that the period applied to. Women's deaths, whether she was happy, is not established by any record I have found. George VI's first years as king were years of managed transition under conditions of increasing European instability. He learned the job in circumstances that would have tested a more naturally prepared person, working through the red boxes with the methodical care that his brother had not brought to them, reading the Foreign Office papers with the attention they required, conducting himself in public with a dignity that demanded continuous effort from man whose stammer worsened under pressure. He had equerries who drilled him in elocution. He had advisers who prepared him for each significant engagement. He had a wife who managed the domestic and social environment with the thoroughness Wallis had managed Edward's more private world, and who brought to the management an additional quality that Wallis's management had not had. She wanted the institution to succeed. She had no ambivalence about it. The crown was hers to protect, and she intended to protect it. Queen Mother's management of her position from 1937 onward was a 50-year exercise in institutional identity construction that has not been fully examined in any biography that appeared during her lifetime. The authorized biographies, two major ones, William Shawcross and by Lady Longford's earlier work, are respectful documents that treat their subject with the care that biographers of living subjects give to people who have approved the project. The unofficial accounts, including ones based on palace staff testimony collected after her death, suggest a more complete picture. She controlled access to herself and to the story of her life with the same thoroughness that she controlled her public appearances. Quests for information about her relationship with the Windsors were declined or deflected or redirected to the authorized channels. Authorized channels produced authorized responses. The authorized responses were consistent with the romantic narrative and with the narrative of own story as its heroic counterpart. The woman who stayed, the woman who served, woman whose husband was killed young by the duty the abdication forced on him. That last point is one she made in private, frequency that people who knew her confirm. George VI died on February 6, 1952 at the age of 56 of lung cancer. He had been ill for years, had had an operation for cancer in September 1951, and had continued to discharge his duties through the illness with the same stoic application that had characterized his reign. Queen Mother believed and said that the stress of the throne he had never been prepared for and had been forced to accept by his brother's departure, was what had killed him early. Whether this was medically accurate is complicated. He was a heavy smoker. Lung cancer in men of his generation was common independent of stress. The belief that the abdication had cost him his life gave her grief the specific quality of a grievance. Grievance maintained for 60 years is not merely an emotion, it is a position. Windsor campaign to recover the HRH title for Wallis ran from 1937 until Edward's death in 1972, which is 35 years. Correspondence between Edward and the palace on this subject fills a substantial portion of the Windsor archive. He wrote letters, sent intermediaries, made formal requests through official channels, appealed to his niece the Queen, appealed through Walter Monckton, appealed through successive private secretaries. The palace's responses were consistent. The decision had been made. The position would not change. Grounds were constitutional and would not be revisited. He did not accept this. He continued writing. The refusals continued. Time of his death, the campaign had become one of the fixed features of his life in exile, cause he maintained with a tenacity that he had rarely applied to official duty when he had it. The Wallis shared his intensity about the title is less clear from the available evidence. She wore it as an injury. She was correct that it was an injury. Whether she felt it with his specific heat is a question her more controlled correspondence does not resolve. Palace's management of the post-abdication Windsors was an extended operation in containment. Could not be brought back into the family circle without the implications of that return, disturbing, carefully constructed narratives. Could not be pushed further away without the treatment of a former king becoming a public relations problem. The solution, arrived at over years rather than as a single decision, was the management of their distance. Contact to prevent the estrangement becoming scandalous, not enough to give them standing. Edward was invited back on specific occasions, always carefully chosen, always brief. The tour of Britain in 1953 for the funeral of Queen Mary, his mother. Visit to Windsor for the unveiling of a memorial in 1967. The final visit to London in 1972. He was dying of cancer, and the Queen came to see him at the house in the Bois de Boulogne. He was photographed at a window, having stood to receive her looking out. He died 10 days later. Wallis came for his funeral. She stayed at Buckingham Palace. She did what was required of her in the formal days of lying in state and burial. She shook the hands that were extended, spoke the words that were expected, sat in the cars that were provided, and bore the scrutiny of the British public seeing her in person for the first time in 36 years. She was 75 years old. She went back to France and began dying in her own way, more slowly and with the particular undignity of a gradual mental withdrawal that lasted 14 more years. The Queen had said to her during the Buckingham Palace visit, was not reported by any of the people present. Means either that no one heard it or that no one spoke of it. Both are possible. Palace was very good at rooms that contained what happened in them. The decision to tour Germany in October 1937 was either the most politically obtuse act of a post-abdication life that contained several candidates for that distinction, or it was the act of a man who was sending a message to the people who had removed him, or it was both things simultaneously, is the most accurate account. Charles Beddoe, whose house the Windsor wedding had been held in 4 months earlier, organized the tour. Beddoes was a figure of considerable complexity. He had been born in France, had emigrated to America, made his fortune developing an industrial efficiency system that bore his name, and that was implemented in factories across the United States and Europe through the 1920s and 1930s. The Beddoe system was essentially a scheme for measuring worker productivity and compensating workers, Frenchly based on their output above a fixed minimum. American labor unions hated it. The CIO had condemned it. Several major corporations had abandoned it after worker protests. The man who had implemented it in enough factories to make himself rich was for not a neutral figure when it came to questions of labor and capital. His connection to the German economy was substantial. He had implemented the Bedo system in German industrial operations and had maintained professional relationships with German industrial managers, and by extension, with the German government that managed those relationships during the Nazi period. He was not, as far as the evidence establishes, ideological Nazi. He was a man of business who dealt with whoever was running the country that contained his business interests. 1937, what was running Germany was the Nazi government. The tour he organized for the Windsors was presented to the Duke as a working visit, focused on labor and housing conditions in Germany, ostensibly a continuation of the interest in workers' welfare that Edward had expressed throughout his time as Prince of Wales. The Welsh Valley's visits of the 1930s, famous "something must be done" remark at a depressed Monmouthshire village, general posture of concerned reformism that had made him popular with precisely the sections of the British public that the palace feared might come devoted to his memory after the abdication, were invoked as the purpose of the German trip. He was going to examine German industrial housing. He was going to see what Hitler's Germany had done for workers. The British government was not consulted in advance. Foreign Office learned of the trip in September, a month before it was scheduled to begin. The reaction was alarm, followed by a series of urgent communications from the British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Neville Henderson, advising against it. Henderson's objection was both diplomatic and practical. Any visit by the Duke of Windsor to Germany at this moment, German-British relations were at a sensitive point, would be interpreted in the international press as something more than a private labor relations inspection trip, and the Nazi government would make every possible use of the association. Henderson was right on both counts. Tour went ahead anyway. It began on October 12, 1937, and continued for 11 days. The Windsors were received with a protocol that was, deliberately and visibly, the protocol extended to visiting heads of state, rather than to private individuals. Flags at the stations were royal flags. The official cars were government cars. Receptions at factories and housing projects were attended by senior Nazi officials. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, organization that had replaced the suppressed trade unions, was their principal guide. Wallis was addressed as Your Royal Highness throughout. Title the British government had denied her receiving its effective recognition in the country, that the British government was watching with increasing alarm. The photographs that were taken during the tour are what most people know the tour by. Edward giving the Nazi salute, full right arm extended, at a Nazi salute from a group of German workers. At another location his arm raised again. And then on October 26, Berghof on the Obersalzberg, sitting across from Adolf Hitler in the formal photographs that were released to the press. Meeting at the Berghof lasted 2 hours. What was said during those 2 hours was not recorded in any document that has been made fully public. Is itself a fact worth noting. The German Foreign Ministry records contain a general account of the conversation. British records contain nothing, because there was no British official present. Edward's account, given in interview form in various years, described the meeting as general, without specific political content, a social conversation between two men who were meeting for the first time. German officials present recalled it differently, describing the Duke as expressing views about the strategic situation and about the possibilities, Anglo-German understanding that they found encouraging. Hitler's own reported reaction, conveyed to aides in the days after the meeting, the Duke of Windsor would have made a good king for England if circumstances had allowed. Circumstances he meant were German circumstances, by which he presumably indicated a post-conquest administration of the kind that Operation Lee would later sketch out in operational terms. The British press covered the tour with the specific combination of embarrassment and minimization certain kinds of coverage of royalty produce when the event cannot be ignored and cannot be framed positively. The American press was less restrained. The photographs of the Nazi salutes were published widely in the United States. Labor unions that had been fighting the Bedhouse system in American factories noted the obvious satisfaction of people whose opponent has just handed them a gift. The man who championed the Bedhouse system was now touring Germany with a former British king. The planned American leg of the tour, which was to have followed the German portion, was cancelled under pressure from organized labor and from a White House that had no interest in giving the Windsors a platform in the United States in the months they chose. The American tour's cancellation was communicated through intermediaries. through the kind of polite regrets that powerful institutions produce when they want to achieve a result without stating it as a result. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in her diary about the Windsors in a way that made clear she found the German tour incomprehensible and the planned American visit unwelcome. The White House's position, under the pressure of labor opposition, and the growing understanding among the American political establishment that the European situation was not improving in the direction anyone had hoped, was that the visit was inopportune. Beddoes, being the organizing force behind both legs of the trip, issued a public statement and withdrew. The American tour died. British government's private response to the German tour, as distinct from its careful public non-response, documented in internal Foreign Office memoranda. Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, received briefings on the tour's content and on the reception it had been given by the German government. Briefings confirmed what the photographs had already suggested. The Windsors had been received as politically significant guests by a government, understood the symbolic weight of what it was doing, and had handled the reception accordingly. Question that Eden and his officials faced was the same question that Baldwin's government had faced in December 1936 and that Churchill's government would face in the summer of 1940. What do you do with a former British king who represents a kind of legitimacy to certain sections of British opinion and who is making himself available to a foreign government with which Britain's relations are deteriorating? Answer in all three of these situations was a variation on the same: contain, manage, minimize public visibility. Ribbentrop, October 1937, was no longer the German ambassador to Britain. He had been recalled to Berlin to serve as Hitler's foreign policy advisor and was on his way to becoming foreign minister. His connections to the Windsors continued through intermediaries and through the social networks of the European aristocracy, which had a specific kind of porousness to German influence in the late 1930s that the war would eventually and permanently close. The dinner parties of pre-war London, where the German ambassador sat beside people who mattered in British public life, and where certain conversations happened over the dessert course, were a phenomenon that ended in September 1939, and that the surviving participants were subsequently reluctant to describe in detail. What the German tour did to the public story of the abdication was to complicate it in ways that the romantic narrative could absorb but not dissolve. The photographs existed. They were published. People had seen them. Portion of the British public that had been sympathetic to Edward in December 1936 had received the abdication broadcast as a love story and had felt genuine emotion at the departure of a king they had liked. Now had photographic evidence that the man they had mourned was raising his arm in a Nazi salute 11 months after leaving. Readjustment this required was not the dramatic reversal of opinion that sudden revelations sometimes produce. It was the slower, quieter process by which a story you have been given begins to feel wrong in ways you cannot fully articulate, and you stop telling it to yourself. Pallas understood this process and managed it. The German tour photographs were not suppressed, because suppression was not available as an option once they were published in the international press. What was managed was the framing. Duke was foolish, not treasonous. He was naive, not complicit. He was a private individual whose political views were unfortunate but whose capacity to act on them was limited by his lack of official position. These framings were not entirely false, had the quality of the stateable truth that Baldwin's management of the abdication had also used. The part that can be said is said, part that cannot be said is not. What could not be said in October 1937 was what the German Foreign Ministry's files recorded about the conversations at the Berghof and about the Duke's expressed views on the strategic situation. Could not be said was the Foreign Office's private assessment of the German tour's political significance. Could not be said was the accumulating intelligence picture that was being assembled in Whitehall, and that pointed the consistency of multiple sourced reports over multiple years in a direction that the palace had decided very deliberately not going to be the public direction of the story. The public direction of the story was love. It was a more convenient direction, and it was not entirely fictional, and it lasted for longer than any honest assessment of the historical evidence could justify. Three things about it are not contradictory. They are three true things about a managed story, and the management of it is part of the history. New Duke of Windsor crossed the Channel the morning after his broadcast. He sailed on HMS Fury, a destroyer named with what might have seemed, someone attending to such things, an uncomfortable irony, He arrived in Boulogne in the early hours of December 12 and made his way to Austria. Friends had offered him a house in the mountains near Enzersfeld. He spent the next several months in waiting. Waiting was not comfortable. The terms under which he had left England were only beginning to be worked out. He was the Duke of Windsor, title created for him by his brother immediately after the abdication, and he was entitled to the style His Royal Highness. He had been given a financial settlement. His brother had agreed to pay him £50,000 a year from the privy purse, an arrangement that was later disputed and amended, and the subject of bitter correspondence between Edward and the palace for years. He had kept Fort Belvedere technically, though it was made clear that his continued presence there was not expected. What he had not been given, what would become the central grievance of his long exile, was the one thing he cared about more than any of the financial questions. Formal acknowledgement that the woman he had married, when he married her, would bear the same title he did. Question of whether the Duchess of Windsor should be styled Her Royal Highness was decided formally in 1937. George VI issued letters patent specifying that the HR style would not pass to the Duke's wife. The legal justification, which the government's law officers provided under pressure, was technical and contested, argument being that Wallis had not been born into the royal family, and therefore did not hold the status as a matter of right. Practical reality was that the decision was a deliberate slight, and everyone involved knew it was a deliberate slight. The man who authorized it, or who allowed it to be authorized in his name, doing so under pressure from a source that the official records are careful about naming. The Queen Mother wanted Wallis denied the title. Queen Mother communicated this view to those around her, with a consistency that left those around her in no doubt about its depth. Official position was that the denial was a matter of constitutional propriety. The actual position, the papers of people close to the palace have gradually made clearer over decades, was that it was a punishment, and a deliberate one, for something that the Queen Mother had decided was unforgivable. Edward was devastated by the decision, in a way that surprised people who had expected him to be more philosophical about it. He had given up the throne, he had accepted his exile, at least in the sense that he had not mounted any campaign for his return. He had accepted the loss of his country and his family, and his position and his purpose. What he could not accept, and what he wrote about in letters for decades, and complained about in conversations for longer than that the woman he had given all of that up for was being refused the 3 letters that would acknowledge her place in his life. It was petty, in the way that only institutions with a sufficiently long tradition of pettiness have mastered the form. The pettiness was deliberate. It was also effective, because it meant that every official occasion at which the Windsors might appear, every possible reconciliation between Edward and his family, every arrangement that might have allowed some functional relationship to continue, shadowed by the question of Wallis's title and the answer that the palace refused to give. The Windsors married on June 3, 1937, the Château de Cande in France's Loire Valley. The building was the property of an American industrial businessman named Charles Beddoes. Politics would later become a serious problem for the Windsors, and who seems, in retrospect, to have been one of the more problematic connections in a network that was generating problems at a pace Edward either couldn't perceive or didn't care to address. The marriage was attended by some of their French and English friends, and by a handful of Edward's old associates, by no member of the British royal family. George VI had made clear that attendance was not to happen, and the message had been received. Only clergymen willing to conduct an Anglican service for the twice-divorced couple, a vicar from Darlington named Robert Anderson Jardine, turned up against the wishes of the Archbishop of Canterbury and was subsequently suspended from his clerical duties. Ceremony was reported around the world with the kind of attention that events which have already generated enormous coverage tend to receive. Photographs of the Duke and his new Duchess were distributed and published. Wallis wore a dress of pale blue silk crepe designed by Maine Rousseau Botcher, later known simply as Maine Botcher. She looked by every account calm and composed and elegant. The Duke looked by every account completely and entirely happy. The happiness was real. It would remain real for the rest of Edward's life, in the sense that he never regretted the choice, in the terms in which he had publicly framed it. Continued to love Wallis, continued to organize his life around her, continued to find in her the quality of focused attention that he had been seeking since before they met. The exile made him bitter, and the treatment of Wallis by his family made him angrier as time passed rather than reconciling him to it, but the relationship itself remained, to the end, the thing he had said it was. What Wallis thought about the marriage, the years of exile settled into a routine, is preserved only in the fragments that careful readers of her correspondence and the accounts of her friends have assembled. She was fond of Edward. She was also, it seems clear, aware that she was now trapped in a situation she had not fully chosen. The life ahead of her was the life of the permanent exile, and that the price of the relationship was the permanent substitution of that exile. Everything else she might have had. The social world they inhabited in the years immediately following the marriage was both glamorous and hollow. Moved among the wealthy international set, the Americans in Paris, the English aristocrats who were rich enough to have houses in France, industrialists and socialites who collected the famous the way other collectors pursue objects. They were received, they entertained, travelled, and they were also within the specific world they had been born into, and the specific world their titles placed them at the edge of. Nowhere. Not in Britain, not in the royal family, not in the institution that had defined Edward's life and that he had given up without, it seems, fully understanding what the giving up would feel like day after day for 35 years. Charles Beddoes, who had provided his chateau for the wedding, and who had organized the German tour that would follow, businessman with connections in both American industrial circles and the Nazi economic establishment, man who had built a career consulting on labor efficiency that had made him controversial and wealthy, and had given him relationships across the ideological spectrum that would seem less neutral when the war came. In the autumn of 1937, Beddoes was the architect of the October Germany tour. Decision to proceed with it, against the explicit advice of Churchill and the strong opposition of the British government, one of the clearest demonstrations available of Edward's capacity for misjudgment, at the moments when the stakes were highest. Tour was officially framed as a study of German labour conditions, consistent with Edward's long-standing interest in the situation of workers in industrial economies. He had visited coal mines in Wales, had spoken about unemployment in terms that his government found constitutionally improper, had a genuine interest rooted in real observation in the lives of working people. The German Labour Front, which organized the tour, presented it in those terms: a humanitarian inquiry. The framing was transparent to everyone except apparently the people accepting it. German labor conditions in October 1937 were the conditions of a totalitarian state that had absorbed its unions into a single government-controlled organization that was directing its workforce toward the production of military materiel, that was operating under a political system that had already demonstrated its methods in the concentration camps that were not yet being spoken openly in European drawing rooms, but were not unknown to people who paid attention to information available in print. Framing of the tour as labour research was propaganda, and the British government said so, privately and then somewhat less privately, as the tour date approached. Churchill wrote to Edward urging him not to go. Duke of Windsor did not take the advice. He had other motivations. He wanted Wallis to be received with the honours that had been denied to her in Britain. He wanted the validation that royal treatment by the Nazi state would provide. He was also, dimension of his motivation is the one that his biographers have been most careful around, genuinely interested in what Germany had built and in whether a relationship between Britain and a Germany that felt respected might be better than trajectory toward confrontation that British foreign policy appeared to be following. These motivations were not mutually exclusive, and they were all active in the man who confirmed the tour against all advice. He wanted respect for his wife. He wanted respect for himself. He wanted to prove that he still mattered. He wanted to make a point to the British government that had managed his departure, and he was, the evidence that his own remarks and the German diplomatic records provide, genuinely sympathetic to the political and economic model that he was about to give a public endorsement. The tour ran from October 12 to October 23, 1837. The Duke and Duchess arrived in Berlin to crowds that had been organized to receive them, and did so with the enthusiasm that organized crowds capable of producing. They visited factories and housing projects and labor camps and various showpiece institutions of the German state, attended dinners and receptions. They were treated everywhere as if the Duchess of Windsor were a queen consort making a state visit, was precisely the treatment they had come for. On October 22nd, they travelled to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. Meeting lasted approximately an hour. The Duke spoke reasonable German. Hitler received them with the warmth that he brought to encounters he considered valuable. Photographs were taken. Photographs were taken of the Duke, giving the Nazi salute. The photographs ran in newspapers around the world. Ran the day they were taken, and they ran for decades afterward, every time anyone wanted to illustrate the point about the former king and his sympathies. They showed a man who was not performing an awkward compliance with local custom, holding his hand up reluctantly in the manner of a visitor who was being caught in a ceremony he hadn't anticipated. He raised his arm with the ease of someone doing something natural, and he stood beside Adolf Hitler with the composed expression of a man who was being received as he deserved to be received. The British government watched all of this with a combination of fury and helplessness. Duke was a private citizen, technically, though his title and his connection to the British royal family made him a public figure with public impact. He had been advised against the tour. He had been told, through channels available to him, British government considered his presence in Germany a propaganda gift to the Nazi state. He had gone anyway. Foreign Office's files on the Duke of Windsor grew substantially in the autumn of 1937. German ambassador's dispatch about the encounter was captured after the war and confirmed what the British had suspected. Germans saw the Duke as a meaningful symbolic asset and were already thinking about how that asset might be used in a more direct way if the circumstances arose. The circumstances arose in 1940. France fell to German forces in June of that year. Duke and Duchess of Windsor had been in Paris, where Edward had been serving in a nominal military capacity as a liaison officer attached to the British forces in France. When Paris fell and the British forces withdrew, the Windsors left for the south of France. They moved quickly, taking what could be taken from their Paris house in the hours available, and by June 19 they were driving toward the Spanish border, crossed into Spain. The German ambassador in Madrid was notified of their arrival. Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, cabled his Madrid office with instructions to make contact. The plan that the German foreign ministry had been developing for several months would become known as Operation Willy when the relevant files were captured and published. Simple in its outline and remarkable in its ambition. The Germans believed, or told themselves they believed, the Duke of Windsor was sympathetic enough to Germany and resentful enough of the British establishment to be potentially useful in a post-conquest scenario. If Germany won the war, which in the summer of 1940 seemed to a great many people like a real possibility, compliant former king with a continuing connection to certain elements of British opinion might be valuable in the administration of a defeated. The plan had several phases. In the immediate term, Ribbentrop wanted to keep the Windsors in Europe rather than allowing them to return to. He dispatched agents to Madrid and then Lisbon, where the Windsors moved in July to maintain contact. He arranged for German-friendly local figures to entertain them and to provide social occasions at which German intermediaries could make their pitch. Exactly the Duke said during those weeks in Madrid and Lisbon is documented in the German Foreign Ministry files, and those files are, any fair reading of them, disturbing. The German documents record the Duke making remarks about the war that were at minimum careless and at maximum treasonous, expressing doubt about Britain's capacity to win, suggesting that Churchill's government was driving Britain toward destruction, indicating willingness to discuss the situation further if circumstances changed. German documents are not objective sources, and they were written by people with strong interests in characterizing the Duke as sympathetic, may exaggerate his openness, and they certainly frame his remarks in terms favorable to Berlin's desired narrative. They are consistent with each other across multiple reports, and with other evidence about the Duke's state of mind and his political views in period, and the historians who have examined them most carefully have generally concluded that they cannot be dismissed as simple fabrication. Churchill was informed of the situation. He was by this point Prime Minister. The existence of a former British king in neutral Portugal with German agents paying him sustained attention was a problem he could not ignore. His first instinct was to recall the Duke to Britain, but the palace and the government shared a clear-eyed assessment that the Duke's return to Britain in the current political climate would be complicated in ways that could not be fully managed. The solution Churchill offered, telegram that he sent to the Duke on July 6, was the governorship of the Bahamas. The Bahamas, colonial governorship of a group of small islands in the Caribbean, several thousand miles from the European war and even further from any location. Political significance. The offer was dressed up as an important wartime posting, which no one involved believed. It was accepted by the Duke with the reluctant fury of a man who understood perfectly what it meant. He called it his exile. He wrote to friends about it with a bitterness that makes clear he knew the difference between a real appointment and a managed removal. He accepted it because he had no real alternative. Churchill had made clear that there were difficulties about his returning to Britain. Difficulty was not merely logistical. The Duke's departure for the Bahamas was delayed for several weeks, while the Germans continued their efforts. Ribbentrop sent an SS intelligence officer, Walter Schellenberg, to Portugal to manage the operation directly. The Germans attempted, through a series of intermediaries, to persuade the Duke to remain in Europe, offering various inducements. The persuasion did not succeed. Windsor sailed for the Bahamas on August 1, 1940. In Nassau, the Duke served as governor for 5 years. It was not a good assignment. He made clear that he knew it. He dealt with a labor unrest situation in 1942 that he handled badly and that required the intervention of American authorities to prevent from becoming worse. He made public remarks throughout the war that questioned the wisdom of continuing the fight, rather than negotiating a peace, remarks that the British press did not publish, but that the American FBI was recording and reporting to President Roosevelt and that Churchill was being briefed on. The FBI file on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor that accumulated during the war years runs to hundreds of pages. It includes reports from American intelligence officers who monitored their activities in Nassau and during their visits to the United States, and it includes several memoranda sent to Roosevelt himself warning of the Duke's apparent sympathies and the risk that his position, the Bahamas, gave him access to information about Allied shipping movements in the Caribbean. The memoranda about the Duchess were, if anything, more specific than those about the Duke. American intelligence had been tracking her contacts before the war and continued to do so. File included reports about conversations she had had with individuals connected to German intelligence channels. None of this was published during the war. None of it could be, because the publication of allegations of this kind about a former British king and his American wife, in the middle of a war that Britain desperately needed American support to prosecute, would have been diplomatically catastrophic. Churchill managed the situation by keeping the Duke contained in the Bahamas, by monitoring his communications, by ensuring that the flow of information that reached him was carefully controlled. The war ended in 1945. Germany surrendered. The British, American and French forces that swept across the remnants of the Nazi Empire captured, among the vast archive of the German Foreign Ministry, files relating to the Duke of Windsor and Operation Willy. These files were immediately classified. Decision about what to do with them occupied the British and American governments for years, because the files were evidence of a former British king's wartime contacts with the enemy government. Implications of making those contacts public were severe. The monarchy was in a different position after the war than it had been before. George VI had served with evident devotion through 6 years of conflict. The Queen Mother had become a figure of genuine public love, woman who had stayed and shared the bombing, and walked through the East End in her good clothes and looked at the damage with a face that said she was looking at something personally offensive to her. The contrast between this story and the story in the German files could not have been more complete. The files were processed. Historians were brought in to organize them as part of the larger German Foreign Ministry documents project. British, American and French governments agreed in principle to include the Windsor material in the publication of those documents. Churchill intervened. In 1953, Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister again following his return to office in 1951, contacted President Eisenhower. The subject of his contact was the Windsor files. Churchill asked Eisenhower to agree to the suppression of the most damaging material, specifically the documents relating to Operation Willy and the Duke's conversations with German intermediaries in 1940. Eisenhower agreed. Decision was documented in British government files that were eventually released, and the documentation is unambiguous. Churchill wanted the material suppressed. He got what he wanted. The Windsor files, as they were called, drawn from the publication scheduled for that year and held back. They were eventually released in 1957. The release was managed carefully. Framing encouraged skepticism about the German sources. The publication attracted academic attention, but relatively limited public coverage, partly because the material required careful reading to understand. and partly because the palace's ability to shape the framing of coverage about the royal family was by 1957 thoroughly established. Andrew Morton's 2015 book pulled this material together for a general audience and made the central argument explicit. The abdication crisis had been shaped by Edward's Nazi sympathies as much as by the marriage question. Palace had known this and had managed the public story accordingly for decades. Romantic narrative was the institutional cover for a departure with causes the palace found safer to leave unexamined. The book was treated in certain quarters as sensationalism, the palace's ability to cause certain kinds of coverage to be coded as sensationalist, to ensure that serious historical arguments appearing in popular form were received as entertainment rather than scholarship, itself part of the story. The romantic narrative had been in circulation for nearly 80 years by the time Morton's book appeared. Extraordinarily well established. The cognitive dissonance required to read a detailed account of the Windsor files and then continue to describe the abdication primarily as a love story is the considerable, and considerable cognitive dissonance is available to people who need it. Institutional incentives on the palace's side remained consistent. The Queen Mother, who was alive until 2002 and who remained an enormously popular public figure for the last decades of her life, presented one pole of the abdication narrative, the woman who had stayed, who had served, who had made the best of what the departure had forced upon her. Her continued public presence was itself an argument for the romantic narrative, because her story only worked in the way it had been told if Wallis was the villain and the abdication was the injury. A more complicated account of the abdication, one that foregrounded the German connection, would have required a more complicated account of the Queen Mother, one that acknowledged that the management of the narrative had served her interests as well as the palace's, that her 60-year campaign against Wallis had been enabled by the romantic framing and had in turn reinforced it. Count existed in the academic literature. It did not exist in the official narrative. It has not existed in the most widely consumed versions of the story. Duchess of Windsor spent her last years in the house in the Bois de Boulogne that she and Edward had occupied for 2 decades. Edward had died in May 1972 of throat cancer, having returned to Britain once in his final weeks for a visit from Queen Elizabeth II that was, by the accounts of those present, warm and real, and too late. He was buried at Frogmore. Wallis attended the funeral, staying at Buckingham Palace, experiencing whatever she experienced during those days in a country that had defined her as its enemy for 35 years, and was now giving her a bed in its most official residence. She returned to France and began her own decline. Latter years were not dignified in the ways she had spent her life pursuing dignity. Her health failed. House was maintained with continued precision by a staff whose loyalty was owed more to her legend than to the person she had become. She fell and broke her hip. Her mind went. She spent her last years unable to communicate and effectively unable to move, tended by nurses and managed by her lawyer Suzanne Blum, whose control over access to the Duchess was total enough that people who had known Wallis decades were refused entry. Blum was controversial among those who had known the Windsors well. She was fiercely protective of the Windsor name and the Windsor finances and the Windsor papers. The decisions she made in Wallis's final years about what was preserved and what was destroyed have shaped, permanently, it is possible to know about the woman's inner life. A substantial portion of Wallis's correspondence and diaries did not survive. This was by Wallis's own earlier instruction, or by decisions made on her behalf after she could no longer make decisions. Entirely clear. She died on April 24, 1986. She was 89 years old. Body was flown to Britain and she was buried at Frogmore on April 29 alongside Edward, in the ground that had always been closed to her while she was alive, and that was now gesture that the palace makes when it needs to close a chapter, given to her as a permanent address. The royal family attended the service. Queen was there, and the Queen Mother, who was 85 years old and who had outlived the woman she had hated for 50 years, and who attended the funeral of the woman she had never received with the expression of a person who has survived something. Gravestone at Frogmore reads, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, June 1996 to April 24, 1986, no HRH. Title she had been denied in life was not given to her in death. The palace was very consistent over a very long time about its decisions. The abdication was, in its full account, is not the story that was offered on December 11, 1936, or in the decades of films and documentaries and authorized biographies and careful newspaper coverage that followed it. It was the managed removal of a man who had alarmed his government, his officials, his prime minister, his foreign secretary, the intelligence services of at least two allied governments, for a combination of reasons that included his Nazi sympathies, constitutional unreliability, his political instability, and his personal conduct, whose departure was made possible and made presentable by the genuine personal fact of a marriage that a constitutional government could not port. The woman who was named as the reason survived the naming by 50 years and died in a house in Paris that was maintained with her characteristic precision, alone except for nurses who were paid to be there, in a country that had never been quite willing to let her go, and was never quite willing to let her in. Having spent her life becoming the best possible version of something the world had decided to need a villain for, she was not entirely innocent of everything that could be charged against her. The palace was not entirely dishonest in everything it said about her. Truth that was available in December 1936 was partial and complicated, and the people who managed it into the romantic narrative were not entirely cynical, because the romantic narrative was true in its limited way and served purposes that some of them genuinely believed were right. Things are compatible. History is full of situations in which partial truths serve convenient purposes without being simple lies, in which the management of those partial truths leaves out what matters most. Matters most in this story is not whether Wallis Simpson was a good woman or a bad one, because those categories have never been adequate to real historical complexity. Matters is that the institution that spent decades managing the narrative of her story did so because the full story contained material that was genuinely dangerous to its reputation and to the carefully constructed public identity of the people who led it. Matters is that the files existed, that the documents were captured, that the conversations in Spain and Portugal were reported and recorded. Churchill tried to suppress them and partly succeeded, and that the history of the most famous abdication in the modern world is still, in the most widely consumed versions of it, the story that was designed rather than the story that happened. German surrender in May 1945 produced, among the vast material consequences of the end of the war, document recovery operation that was unprecedented in scale and in the quality of what it found. American, British, French forces who moved through Germany in the final weeks of the war were followed by teams of archivists, historians, and intelligence officers whose task was to identify, secure, and eventually process the records of the German state. Records ran to millions of documents. They covered everything the Nazi government had done, the administrative apparatus of the regime, correspondence of its ministries, the operational files of its intelligence services, the diplomatic record of its foreign ministry. Foreign ministry records were particularly significant. They covered the full range of Germany's international relationships across the years of Nazi government, including the years of negotiation and accommodation and the years of conflict. Included the operational files of the German embassies in London, Paris, Washington, Madrid, Lisbon, every other capital where German diplomats had been working to advance the regime's interests. They included the cables, the memoranda, confidential assessments, and the records of private conversations between German officials and the foreign nationals with whom they had dealt. Windsor material was within this archive. It was identified early because the people processing the foreign ministry files recognized the name, understood the sensitivity of what they had found. The files relating to the Duke of Windsor covered the period from 1933 to 1945 and included London dispatches from von Horsch and von Ribbentrop, the reports on Edward's conversations with German officials during his time as king, records of the Operation Willy planning and execution in 1940, and the reports on the Windsor's activities in Nassau during the war years. British team processing the archive understood immediately that the Windsor files presented a problem, contained documentary evidence of a former British king's wartime contact with enemy officials, evidence of his sympathy for the German position in contexts where that sympathy had political implications, evidence of a German intelligence operation designed to exploit that sympathy in a post-conquest scenario. The material could not be falsified. Too many copies existed in too many locations. It could not be entirely suppressed, because the American and French archivists who were processing the same files had access to the same material. What it could be was managed. British government's first response was to attempt to secure the files through the official channels of the Joint Allied Document Recovery. 4. Eisenhower Agreement, the publication of captured German documents, gave Britain a seat at the table in decisions about what would be published and when, but it did not give Britain a unilateral veto. The publication of the major German Foreign Ministry documents was an agreed international scholarly project, and the principle behind it was full disclosure. Deviations from full disclosure required the agreement of all four parties. Churchill's approach to the Windsor Files problem was direct. He wrote to Eisenhower in the summer of 1953, when he was Prime Minister for the second time, and when the publication of the German Foreign Ministry documents was reaching the sections that included the Windsor material. His letter asked Eisenhower to agree to the suppression of the most damaging documents. He framed the request in terms of the benefit to the monarchy and the Allied relationship, and Eisenhower agreed. Correspondence between Churchill and Eisenhower on this subject was itself classified and was released through the British National Archives. Decades later, the specific release date, depending on which tranche of the relevant files you are looking at. Correspondence became available. It confirmed what historians who had been working on the margins of the story had suspected for years. The suppression had been a deliberate bilateral government act, and not the result of administrative oversight or scholarly judgment. Churchill actually wrote to Eisenhower was not a request to destroy the documents. That would have been too crude and too easily discovered. He asked that the relevant material be withheld from the current publication schedule, and that it be handled, when it was eventually published, in a way that gave the British government adequate time to prepare. The language of the request was the language of Allied cooperation and of concern for an institution that mattered to both governments in the context of a Cold War that required stable Western democracies with functioning constitutional systems. The monarchy was in this framing a Cold War asset. Damaging it by releasing material that showed its most recent abdicating king in warm contact with the Nazis was not in anyone's interest. Eisenhower agreed. The material was held back from the immediate publication. In 1957, included in a later volume of the Documents on German Foreign Policy series, under the title The Windsor File, prefatory note from the editors that gave context about the document's provenance, the nature of German intelligence reports as sources, the interpretive challenges involved in reading them. The framing encouraged caution. It did not bury the material. It dressed it in a suit of scholarly qualification that made it harder for a general reader to know what to do with it. 1957 release was covered in the press. The Times, the Manchester Guardian, and several American papers ran articles about it. Coverage noted the existence of the documents, summarized their most significant contents, and included the official qualification that German intelligence reports were unreliable sources. Then the coverage moved on, as coverage does, because there was no anniversary to trigger a return to the subject, no living royal figure implicated directly, no single document that could be extracted and placed on a front page in a way that forced a national conversation. Palace was not idle during this period. Its management of the Windsor story through the 1950s and 1960s proceeded on several tracks simultaneously. The official biography of Edward VIII, which was to be authorized, was managed carefully. Access to the Windsor archive was controlled. Requests from historians and journalists for material relating to the abdication and its context were handled through the palace's press office, with the consistent emphasis on the marriage question and the consistent minimization of the political questions. The romantic narrative was not maintained through active deception. It was maintained through the selective provision of access and the selective provision of context. Michael Bloch, lawyer and historian, who worked most closely with the Windsor papers in the 1980s, and who published several volumes of material from the Windsor archive with the cooperation of Matre Suzanne Blum, and then with the papers themselves, important work in making available primary material that had not previously been accessible. His books on the Windsor letters, Secret File on the Duke of Windsor, and on Ribbentrop, established a documentary record that subsequent historians have drawn on extensively. His access was not unlimited, and his conclusions were sometimes contested by people who felt he was too close to his sources. The raw material he made available was more useful than the interpretations he offered. Raw material pointed clearly in the direction of a story more complicated than the romantic one. Academic literature on the abdication from the 1960s onward increasingly reflected this complication. Francis Donaldson's 1974 biography of Edward VIII was the first major account to engage seriously with the German material and to make it central to interpretation of the abdication, rather than treating it as a footnote to the marriage question. She wrote with the caution appropriate to a biography of a still living figure. The Duke of Windsor died in May 1972 and the Duchess lived until 1986. Her account established the framework that subsequent biographies would build on. Martin Allen's work, Michael Bloch's Ziegler's authorized biography of the Duke of Windsor published in 1990, Morton's in 2015. Each added material and each pushed the interpretation in the direction of the political story rather than the romantic one. Ziegler's authorized biography was constrained by its access to palace-controlled materials, meant that the most sensitive documents were not available to him. His account is notable for its candor about Edward's limitations as king, and about the specific failures of judgment that alarmed his officials. For an authorized biography, it is a surprisingly honest book. Morton's 2015 book, 17 Carnations, the first major popular account to make the Nazi connection its central argument, rather than its secondary one. Morton had written about Diana and about other royal subjects, and he brought to the Windsor material the same willingness to argue against the official narrative that had characterized his earlier work. His book was reviewed with the mixture of respect and skepticism that royal books receive when they challenge established framings. The quality of the research was acknowledged. Conclusions were contested by people who preferred the existing story, and the book sold well and was discussed widely. And then, the manner of all books receded. The palace did not respond directly to Morton. It did not need to. Its ability to manage the framing of coverage about the royal family does not require direct responses to specific books. Operates through the ongoing relationship between the palace press office and the media organizations that depend on royal access for their coverage of other, more current royal stories. A book that challenges the historical record on an 80-year-old subject does not require active freshen. It requires the quiet continuation of the environment in which the romantic narrative is the default, in which the official version is the one that gets the benefit of the doubt, in which the alternative reading requires the reader to do substantial work and to accept that the story they have been given for their entire life structurally incomplete. Most readers do not do that work. This is not a criticism of readers, it is an observation about how stories work. Romantic narrative of the abdication has been in circulation since December 1936. It has been reinforced by films, television drama, The Crown's earlier seasons, by the authorized biographies, by the palace's management of documentary access, physical presence of the Queen Mother as living embodiment of the story's heroic half for 65 years, and by the simple fact that love stories are easier to hold in the mind than intelligence assessments. The Crown, Netflix drama that began broadcasting in 2016, is instructive here. Its treatment of the abdication appeared across its first 2 seasons, and which reached an audience of tens of millions, presented the romantic narrative with the production values and the emotional intelligence that premium television provides. German Connection was mentioned, Operation Willy was shown, but the emotional weight of the drama rested on the love story. The emotional weight is where the story sticks. Audiences who watch 2 hours of television about a love story come away remembering the love story. The intelligence material is the context. The love is the content. This is not the drama's fault. Drama requires emotional identification, and emotional identification requires characters who are driven by comprehensible human desires rather than political calculation. Edward's love for Wallis is a comprehensible human desire. German Foreign Ministry's calculation about the possible utility of a compliant former British king in a post-conquest administration is not. Both are historically documented. Only one of them works as the engine of a drama. The palace understands this asymmetry, and has always understood it. Romantic narrative is not merely what the palace preferred. It is the version that fits the shape of story that human minds retain. Political narrative is accurate, important, and substantially forgotten by most people who have technically been exposed to it. Romantic narrative is partially true, partially constructed, and remembered by almost everyone who has ever heard it. This is the thing that the cover-up, in its deepest sense, actually accomplished. Not the suppression of specific documents, though that happened. Not the management of specific journalists, though that also happened. The deepest accomplishment was the establishment of a narrative that fit the available emotional slots so well that the more accurate version could be published and discussed and reviewed, quietly resume its position on the lower shelves, while the comfortable version continued to circulate. Correct earlier refusal should not be reversed by an emotional appeal. The historians have not reversed it. The documents are available. Argument is made. What persists is not ignorance but preference, and preference is harder to argue with than ignorance. Preference is not an error, it is a choice. The people who continue to tell the abdication as a love story are not all misinformed. Some of them know the fuller account and find the love story more satisfying, and there is a version of that preference that is honest about itself. Problem is the version that is not. The house at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne was not a house the Windsors owned. It was a house the city of Paris leased to them through an arrangement with the municipal government that gave them occupation at a nominal rent in exchange for a connection to a name that the French capital found useful for the specific purposes that celebrity names serve in cities that understand the value of having interesting people seen in their streets. Edward had been Prince of Wales and then King of England. French had their own monarchy's memory and their own sense of what a former king looked like in residence. They were prepared to be generous in return for the association. They lived there from 1953. When they returned from New York, where they had spent the immediate post-war years in a rented house in Long Island, till Edward's death in 1972 and then Wallis's until 1986, the house was large, set in its own grounds with a formal garden that Wallis maintained to a standard that visitors consistently described as extraordinary, because Wallis's standards were what they were, regardless of whether anyone was looking, and she had decided that the garden was going to be correct. Interiors were furnished with the same deliberate exactitude she had brought to every domestic environment she had managed. Dining room held 12 comfortably and had been laid with the kind of specific, considered attention to placement and arrangement that her London social world had known 30 years earlier. Social life of the Bois de Boulogne years was not the social life of Bryanston Court or Fort Belvedere, but it was not nothing. They were in Paris, which in the 1950s and 1960s was a city where interesting people gathered for reasons that had to do with the specific quality of French cultural prestige, the relative cheapness of living well, and the particular freedom that expatriate life provided from the obligations of one home country. The Windsors were expatriates in the most complete sense. They had no home country obligations because the home country had made clear they were not invited to have them. People who came to dinner at the Bois de Boulogne house included Americans, whose money was good in France and whose social ambitions were served proximity to a former king. They included European aristocrats who visited Paris in the season. They included journalists, writers, and socialites from several countries who found Edward and Wallis interesting in the way that people who have lived through large historical events are always interesting, provided you find the events more compelling than the experience of living through them, was for the people who did. Ernest Hemingway was at the house on at least one occasion. The Aga Khan came. The Duke of Kent visited. Did other members of the royal family, whose individual willingness to maintain contact varied and whose visits were sometimes complicated by what it meant to be seen visiting a man that the palace was not fully rehabilitating. Gloria Guinness was a friend. Elsie de Wolfe had been. Duchess of Windsor's social circle in the Paris years overlapped substantially with the social world that Truman Capote was simultaneously cultivating and documenting, the world of rich women with good interiors and thin bodies and opinions about everything that Capote found inexhaustible, and that his fiction would eventually use. Edward's days had a structure that Wallis imposed and maintained because without structure, he became, by her own account and by the accounts of people who knew them well, restless and unfocused in a way that made him difficult to live with. He walked, he gardened as he always had. He played golf at the golf club near the Bois de Boulogne where he was a well-known figure. Golf had the quality that outdoor physical activity always had for him, of providing focus through mechanics rather than through thought. He corresponded. The correspondence consumed a portion of every day, partly because he had a large circle of people he kept in contact with, and partly because the campaign to recover the HRH title for Wallis required continuous maintenance. The HRH question was not merely a social vanity. That is how it has sometimes been characterized by people who have found the Windsors' preoccupation with it difficult to sympathize with. Practical consequences in the daily management of their social life, at official functions, at receptions, kind of formal occasions that a former king and his wife continued to attend. Question of how to address the Duchess was a question that each new set of hosts had to navigate without clear guidance. Some gave her the HRH anyway, reasoning that the denial was unkind and the king who had made it was no longer alive. Some adhered to the official position. Some simply avoided the question by avoiding the occasion. Wallis had learned decades of social management to navigate rooms where her status was uncertain. She had been doing it since Baltimore. There is a difference between navigating uncertainty about status as a young woman ascending and navigating it as the wife of a former king at an official function in your 70s, and the difference is partly in what the uncertainty represents. Young woman's uncertainty is the product of where she started. The older woman's is the product of a decision made by the institution that denied. He was 60 when the Windsors returned to Paris. She was 70 when Edward died. She was 89 when she died herself. Years between 70 and 89 were the years in which her life narrowed as lives do, and in which the specific things that had made her what she was, the social intelligence, the precision, the ability to manage any room she entered, came less available to her as her health declined and as the world that had known her significance became increasingly thin. Friends of the 1950s and 1960s were dying. The social world that had gathered in the dining room at the Bois de Boulogne was dispersing in the way that social worlds do when the people who created them age and die. The Paris of the 1970s was not the Paris of the 1950s. The social world that Wallis had navigated with such skill was a world that was passing. She fell and broke her hip in 1975. Recovery was difficult. After the fall, Suzanne Blum's management of the household tightened. Management tightens when the person being managed is less able to resist it. Blum was a lawyer who had represented both Wallis and Charlie Chaplin, among other prominent clients, and she had the specific qualities of the powerful lawyer who works with people of diminishing capacity. A loyalty to the idea of her client and a willingness to make decisions on her client's behalf that the client would have made differently at full capacity. Whether this was protective or controlling depended on who was observing it, and the people who observed it divided accordingly. Michael Bloch, who had worked closely with Blum on the Windsor archive, and whose access to Wallis in her final years was greater than almost anyone outside the household, gave an account of those final years that is among the most detailed available. He described a woman who was physically declining and cognitively withdrawing, and who was being cared for in the manner that she would have wanted. In her own house, with her own things around her, with the standards maintained, the garden was maintained, the house was maintained, staff was there. Whether Wallis in the final years was aware of any of this is not established. She died on April 24, 1986. Was a Thursday. She was 89 years old and 4 months. Her body was flown to Britain aboard a British Airways flight, an arrangement that was made with the quiet efficiency that palace logistics apply to situations of this kind. She lay in state at the chapel at St. George's, Windsor for 2 days. Members of the royal family paid their respects. The funeral took place in the chapel on April 29. She was buried at Frogmore, in the ground beside Edward, in the place that had been prepared for her when his burial was arranged in 1972. Queen was present. The Queen Mother was present. Charles and Diana were present. In the years before their marriage had become its own institutional crisis, and before the questions that the abdication had raised about who the institution would and would not accept had found new applications in new circumstances, Princess Michael of Kent was present. Picture from the graveside shows a small group of figures in dark coats on English spring grass, in the way of English funerals. Headstone at Frogmore reads Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, June 19, 1896, April 24, 1986, no HRH. Palace was consistent in its decisions until the end. Whether a title denied in life needed to be denied in death as well is a question that has a clear answer from the palace's perspective and a less clear answer from anyone else's, but the palace's perspective was the operative one. Abdication's connections to the crises that came after it have not been fully mapped by any single account, partly because the palace's habit of managing each crisis as a discrete event rather than acknowledging the structural continuities has been largely successful, and partly because the connections are sometimes correlative rather than causal and require work to establish. The connections are there. The question of whether the institution can accommodate a person who comes to it from outside its traditional categories, the question that Wallis Simpson posed in 1936, and that the institution answered by removing the king who had introduced her, posed again in 1997 and in the years that followed it, when Diana Spencer's position relative to the institution became untenable. The management of her public image and her private unhappiness became a crisis the palace could not contain. Diana was not a twice-divorced American. She was an aristocrat who had grown up inside the system's social world. The institution had approved her, had then found her, in the specific terms of what she demanded and what she was willing to say in public and to journalists, and eventually in a television interview that was watched by more people than the Abdication broadcast, unmanageable. The parallel is imperfect. All historical parallels are, but the structure is consistent. A person associated with the crown who poses a problem the institution cannot solve through normal channels, a management operation that begins with control of coverage and proceeds towards separation. Public narrative that emphasizes the institution's stability over the individual's complexity. The management fails, the crisis becomes public. Institution absorbs it, presents its own version of events and continues. Harry and Meghan's departure in 2020 is a later instance of the same structural pattern. Prince who found the institution's treatment of his wife intolerable, who said so in terms that went beyond what the palace could manage, who left with the explicit statement that the institution's management of the narrative was dishonest. Palace's management of the coverage of their departure, the briefings to journalists, the calibrated responses to their public statements, management of what was said on the record and what was allowed to appear in sympathetic coverage, consistent with the management of earlier crises. The specific grievances were different. The institution's method was the same. None of this makes the abdication and the marriage question and the German connection less significant. Connections are not about diminishing the original story. They are about understanding it as part of a pattern, rather than as an exception. Palace's management of inconvenient truths about the people associated with it is not a series of separate incidents. It is an institutional practice, refined over decades, that has operated consistently across different crises with different people at their center. Windsor case is the clearest example because it is the oldest, fully documented one. The files are largely available now. Churchill-Eisenhower correspondence is in the archive. The German Foreign Ministry documents are published. Academic account is well established. The romantic narrative coexists with all of this in the public consciousness. Coexistence is itself the evidence of how the practice works. The accurate account and the comfortable one occupy the same cultural space, out the accurate one displacing the comfortable one, because displacement would require the comfortable one's active demolition. Institution has never allowed that. What you have, if you have followed this story to its end, is a case study in how power manages memory, not by destroying what it cannot use, but by surrounding it with so much more comfortable material that the difficult things remain peripheral. German Foreign Ministry files are not a secret. They are in a library. Churchill letter to Eisenhower is available to anyone with a National Archives card. Conversation with Ribbentrop in March 1936 was reported in documents that have been published. Nothing that has been said in this account is classified. The research exists. The argument is made. Historians who have made it have been reviewed and cited and engaged with. And yet the first thing most people will say when asked what the abdication was about is, he gave up the throne for love. This is the accomplishment, not the obsession of a secret, the manufacture of a public preference for the version that was offered, rather than the version that was available. Preference is still intact. It has survived 88 years and the publication of the Marburg Files and the release of the Churchill-Eisenhower correspondence and the television drama that touched on the German connection and the books that made the argument explicitly probably survive this account. The romantic narrative of the abdication is not going to be replaced by a political one in general circulation. Comfortable story is too well established, too emotionally satisfying, too compatible with every subsequent telling of the story across every medium that has taken it up. Can happen is something smaller and more honest, that people who encounter the full account understand that the comfortable story is a part of truth deployed in the service of something that needed the comfortable story, and that the institution that deployed it is still deploying, in different forms, the same methods in the management of its more recent inconveniences. A former king sat before a BBC microphone on December 11, 1936, and told the world he was leaving for love. The British government that had been working to remove him for months sat behind the story that he told, and the woman who was named as the reason for the departure went to France and lived the rest of her life at the center of a story she had not chosen and could not correct. The files are in the archive. The letters are in the libraries. Newspapers from December 1936 are in the microfilm collections of public libraries in every city where this history matters. Comfortable version has been on the radio, on the television, on the streaming platform, in the authorized biography, in the film with the good costumes and the period music. It is the version that the institution made available. Institution was very good at making things available in the form that served it best. What actually happened is in the record. Has been there for decades. It will be there long after the romantic narrative has had its final cinematic adaptation and its final newspaper supplement on a round number anniversary of a December evening when a man said something that was true and something that was not. The world received both in the way the world receives stories, with the preference for the version that requires less of it. Comment below with what surprised you most. And if this channel is where you come for the histories that don't fit the frame you were given, please subscribe. There are more of them. There are always more of them.